Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something that started in a lab, knocked out horses, saved soldiers, mellowed out therapy patients, and somehow ended up in nightclub bathrooms. We're talking about ketamine, the anesthetic that became a party drug, a medicine, and a cultural phenomenon all at once. Not the glamorous story of champagne and red carpets. This is the story of a chemical compound that's been everything from lifesaver to liability, from psychiatric breakthrough to festival contraband. And since this is our brand new channel, before you settle in, maybe take a second to hit like and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what you find here. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now dim those lights. Switch on a fan for that soft white noise. Get comfortable, and maybe question every decision that led to ketamine being used on both racehorses and ravers. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered how a horse tranquilizer ends up at Burning Man? How did scientists create something meant to safely sedate animals, only to watch it become a recreational drug that makes you feel like you're floating through dimensions? What happens to your brain on ketamine? And why do some people swear it cured their depression, while others can't remember their own name for 3 hours? Could you handle the K-hole without panicking? Would you trust a drug that was designed for creatures that weigh 1,000 pounds? And now, congratulations, you've just entered the strange, scientific, surprisingly messy world of ketamine. It's the 1960s. You're in a pharmaceutical lab. Someone just synthesized a compound that's about to change anesthesia, psychiatry, war, and weekend plans forever. Good luck. Let's start at the very beginning. Back when ketamine was just an idea, scribbled on a chalkboard in a research lab. It's 1962, and a chemist named Calvin Stevens is working at Park Davis Pharmaceutical Company in Michigan. His mission? Create a better anesthetic, something safer than PCP, which had a nasty habit of causing hallucinations and violent reactions in patients. Stevens synthesizes a compound called CI-581. It's clean, it's effective, and it knocks you out without killing you, which is always a plus in the pharmaceutical world. Nobody knows it yet, but this little molecule is about to have one of the wildest rides in medical history. Stevens wasn't trying to create a party drug or a psychiatric miracle. He was just trying to solve a very specific problem. PCP, or phencyclidine, had shown promise as an anesthetic, but came with terrifying side effects. Patients woke up violent, confused, or completely detached from reality in the worst possible way. Surgeons needed something that worked like PCP, fast-acting, powerful, effective, but without the psychotic episodes. So Stevens went back to the drawing board, tweaking molecular structures, testing variations, searching for that sweet spot between sedation and insanity. When he finally synthesized CI-581, later renamed ketamine, it looked promising on paper. The molecular structure was similar enough to PCP to suggest it would work as an anesthetic, but different enough that maybe, just maybe, it wouldn't make people lose their minds. Early lab tests were encouraging. Animals sedated with ketamine stayed calm. Their vital signs remained stable, and they woke up without the violent thrashing that plagued PCP trials. Stevens and his team knew they had something, but they didn't yet know what. The thing about pharmaceutical research in the 60s is that it moved fast, maybe too fast by today's standards. There were fewer regulations, less red tape, and a general attitude of let's just try it and see what happens. It was the golden age of drug discovery, when chemists synthesized thousands of compounds hoping to stumble onto the next miracle cure. Some became life-saving medications. Others became recreational disasters. And a few, like ketamine, became both. Stevens presented his findings to Park Davis executives, and they were intrigued. An anesthetic that didn't suppress breathing, that could be used in field hospitals, emergency rooms, and remote locations without fancy equipment. That was marketable. That was valuable. They greenlit further testing, and CI 581 moved from the chemistry lab to the animal testing facility, where things were about to get very interesting. But here's the irony. Stevens created ketamine to avoid the problems of PCP, and in many ways, he succeeded. Ketamine was safer, more predictable, and far less likely to cause violent reactions. But he didn't eliminate the dissociative effects, those strange, dreamlike states where patients felt detached from their bodies and surroundings. He just made them gentler, more manageable. And as it turned out, some people would eventually seek out those exact effects, not as a side effect to tolerate, but as the main event. Stevens had no way of knowing that his tidy little anesthetic would one day be snorted off bathroom counters at raves or used in underground therapy sessions to explore the nature of consciousness. He was just trying to make surgery safer. Mission accomplished, sort of. Before ketamine could touch a human, it had to prove itself on animals. And by animals, we mean horses. Big, expensive, temperamental horses. Veterinarians loved it. Ketamine could sedate a 1,200-pound stallion without the drama of traditional anesthetics that sometimes stop the animal's heart or lungs. It was smooth. It was fast, and the horses woke up confused but alive. Soon zoos were using it on elephants and big cats. Ketamine became the go-to drug for creatures you absolutely could not afford to accidentally kill. Funny how that same drug would later be snorted in festival porta-potties. But we'll get there. Horses are notoriously difficult to anesthetize. They're massive, powerful, and prone to panic. Traditional anesthetics often came with terrifying risks: respiratory depression, cardiac arrest, or worse, waking up mid-surgery and thrashing violently enough to injure themselves and everyone nearby. Veterinarians needed something reliable, and ketamine delivered. When injected, horses would sway slightly, their eyes would glaze over, and then they'd gently sink to the ground in a controlled, almost graceful descent. It looked like magic. What made ketamine special was that it didn't knock out the central nervous system the way older drugs did. The horse's heart kept beating normally. Its lungs kept breathing. All the vital functions hummed along, while the animal entered a trance-like state, awake but not aware, present but not really there. Vets called it dissociative anesthesia, and it was a game changer. Suddenly, routine procedures, hoof surgery, dental work, wound treatment, became exponentially safer. Word spread quickly through the veterinary community. If it worked on horses, what about other large animals? Zookeepers started using ketamine on elephants, rhinos, and big cats like lions and tigers. Imagine trying to sedate a Bengal tiger with a syringe on a stick. You get exactly one chance, and if the drug doesn't work fast, someone's getting mauled. Ketamine worked. It worked consistently, predictably, and without killing expensive, endangered animals. Zoo vets everywhere breathed a collective sigh of relief. But here's where it gets weird. Veterinarians started noticing that animals on ketamine didn't just go to sleep. They went somewhere else. Horses would stand motionless, eyes open, staring into the void like they were receiving a message from another dimension. When they woke up, they'd stumble around, disoriented, as if trying to remember where they'd been. It was unsettling but harmless, And since the animals couldn't exactly describe their experiences, everyone just shrugged and moved on. The success of ketamine in veterinary medicine had an unintended consequence. It made the drug incredibly accessible. Veterinary clinics stocked it in bulk, often with minimal security. Unlike controlled substances used in human medicine, vet-grade ketamine wasn't heavily regulated in the early days. A single bottle could sedate dozens of animals, which also meant it could get dozens of humans very, very high. Decades later, when ketamine exploded onto the recreational drug scene, a huge percentage of it was diverted or stolen from veterinary supplies. But in the early 60s, nobody was thinking about that. Researchers were too busy celebrating. They'd found an anesthetic that worked on everything from cats to elephants, didn't require complex monitoring equipment, and had a safety profile that made traditional anesthetics look downright dangerous by comparison. Ketamine had passed the animal test with flying colors. Now it was time to see what it did to humans. Spoiler: the humans would have a lot more to say about it than the horses did. By 1965, it was time to test ketamine on humans. Early volunteers described strange sensations: floating, detachment, a feeling of being outside their own bodies. Some loved it. Others found it deeply unsettling. Researchers noticed something odd. Patients weren't fully unconscious. Their eyes stayed open, but they weren't really there. They called this state dissociative anesthesia, a fancy term for conscious but completely checked out. It was perfect for surgeries where you needed someone still but not squirming. And while some patients reported vivid dreams or hallucinations, most woke up without the nausea and grogginess caused by older anesthetics. Ketamine was weird, but it worked. The first human to receive ketamine was a prisoner volunteer in 1964. Yes, you read that right, a prisoner. This was standard practice back then. Inmates were often used as test subjects in exchange for reduced sentences or small payments. The man was given a low dose of ketamine and monitored closely. Within minutes, his body relaxed, his speech slowed, and he stared blankly at the ceiling. But he wasn't asleep. When researchers asked him questions, he could hear them, but his responses were delayed, dreamy, disconnected. It was as if his mind had temporarily untethered from his body. After the session, the prisoner described his experience. He'd felt like he was floating above the room, watching himself from a distance. Time had become meaningless. Seconds stretched into hours. Or maybe it was the other way around. He wasn't scared, exactly, but he wasn't comfortable either. It was just strange. The researchers scribbled furiously in their notebooks. This was unlike any anesthetic they'd seen before. The patient was technically conscious, but functionally absent. They'd stumbled onto something entirely new. More volunteers followed. Some were prisoners, some were paid participants, and a few were university students looking for beer money and a weird story to tell at parties. The experiences varied wildly. Some people loved it. They described profound peace, cosmic unity, a sense of dissolving into the universe. Others hated it. They felt trapped, terrified, convinced they were dying or losing their minds. A few reported nightmarish visions, dark tunnels, menacing figures, the sensation of being buried alive. It was a roll of the dice, and no one could predict who would have which reaction. Researchers also noticed physical effects. Unlike traditional anesthetics, ketamine didn't suppress breathing or lower blood pressure dangerously. Patients could maintain their own airways, which was huge for emergency medicine. Their eyes remained open, sometimes blinking, sometimes just staring blankly. which creeped out some of the medical staff but proved the brain was still somewhat active. Heart rate sometimes increased slightly, but nothing alarming. From a purely medical standpoint, ketamine was incredibly safe. But the psychological effects, those were harder to quantify. How do you measure "felt like I was in a different dimension"? How do you record time stopped making sense? The researchers did their best, creating surveys, rating scales, and debriefing interviews. They coined the term emergence phenomena to describe the strange mental states patients experienced while coming out of ketamine anesthesia. Some patients laughed uncontrollably, others cried. A few just sat in silence, trying to process what they'd been through. Despite the weirdness, the trials were considered a success. Ketamine worked as an anesthetic. It just came with a side of existential confusion. Doctors figured they could manage that with proper dosing and maybe some sedatives to smooth out the rough edges. In 1970, the FDA gave ketamine the green light for medical use. And just like that, the strange little molecule born in a Michigan lab was officially part of modern medicine. The visions, the dissociation, the floating sensations, those were just quirks, nothing to worry about, right? When the Vietnam War ramped up in the late 60s, military doctors desperately needed a battlefield anesthetic that was portable, stable, and effective under hellish conditions. Ketamine was the answer. Medics could inject it into wounded soldiers in the jungle, on helicopters, in muddy foxholes, anywhere. It didn't require refrigeration, didn't need precise dosing equipment, and worked fast. Most importantly, it didn't suppress breathing, which meant soldiers could be sedated without suffocating while waiting for evacuation. Thousands of American soldiers were treated with ketamine, and many owed their lives to that little vial. Of course, nobody was talking yet about what happened when those same soldiers came home and remembered the strange, dreamlike state it induced. Vietnam was a nightmare for military medicine. Soldiers were getting torn apart by shrapnel, bullets, and explosive devices in some of the most hostile, remote terrain imaginable. Traditional anesthetics required clean operating rooms, trained anesthesiologists, and monitoring equipment. In the jungle, you had none of that. You had a medic with a syringe, maybe a helicopter 30 minutes away, and a soldier screaming in agony while bleeding into the mud. You needed something fast, portable, and foolproof. Ketamine checked every box. The drug came in small glass vials that could be carried in a medic's pack. It didn't need to be kept cold, which was crucial in the sweltering Vietnamese heat. It could be injected intramuscularly. No need to find a vein on a patient in shock. Within minutes, the wounded soldier would go quiet, eyes open but vacant, pain receptors essentially offline. His breathing would remain steady. His heart would keep pumping, and the medic could stabilize him for transport without worrying about respiratory collapse. For battlefield medicine, ketamine was nothing short of revolutionary. Thousands of soldiers received ketamine during the war. Some got it in the field, some in mobile surgical units, some on evacuation helicopters. It became so common that medics nicknamed it jet fuel for its rapid onset. You'd inject it, and within 60 seconds, the patient was in another dimension, sometimes literally, according to their reports. Soldiers described out-of-body experiences, visions of home, conversations with dead friends, and journeys through tunnels of light. Some found it comforting, others found it terrifying, especially when combined with the trauma of combat. Here's the thing nobody anticipated. Ketamine didn't erase the trauma, it just moved it. Soldiers who were sedated with ketamine often reported fragmented, dreamlike memories of their injuries. They remembered pain, but in a distant, abstract way, as if it had happened to someone else. They remembered being carried to helicopters, but felt like they were watching from above. Some veterans later said ketamine had given them PTSD within PTSD, a trauma wrapped in dissociation, harder to process because it didn't feel fully real. But at the time, those concerns were secondary. The priority was keeping soldiers alive, long enough to get them to a field hospital, and ketamine excelled at that. It saved countless lives and became a staple of military medicine. When soldiers came home, they brought stories of the drug with them, not in medical journals, but in whispered conversations at VA hospitals and late-night bull sessions with fellow veterans. Some remembered ketamine as the thing that saved them. Others remembered it as the thing that made them feel like ghosts. Years later, when ketamine appeared on the streets as a recreational drug, some veterans recognized it immediately. A few even sought it out, hoping to recapture that strange, detached peace they'd felt in the worst moments of their lives. It was self-medication disguised as nostalgia, and it rarely ended well. But in the jungles of Vietnam, ketamine wasn't a party drug or a therapy tool. It was a lifeline. And for the medics who used it, the drug wasn't weird or controversial. It was a miracle in a bottle. They just wished it came without the ghosts. In 1970, the FDA officially approved ketamine for medical use in the United States. It was marketed under the brand name Ketalar, and hospitals quickly adopted it for surgeries, especially in pediatrics and emergency medicine. Kids tolerated it well, and it became the anesthetic of choice for procedures where traditional options were too risky. Burn victims, trauma patients, and people in developing countries without access to complex anesthesia equipment all benefited. Ketamine was cheap, effective, and remarkably safe when used properly. For a while, it looked like modern medicine had found a miracle drug. Spoiler, it wouldn't stay in the hospital for long. FDA approval was a huge deal. It meant ketamine had survived years of scrutiny, testing, and bureaucratic review. It meant doctors could prescribe it confidently, hospitals could stock it openly, and insurance companies would pay for it. Ketalar hit the market with a clean bill of health and glowing recommendations from military doctors, anesthesiologists, and emergency physicians. It was positioned as the safe, modern alternative to older, riskier anesthetics. Pharmaceutical reps visited hospitals with glossy brochures highlighting its benefits. No respiratory depression, rapid onset, minimal equipment needed, safe for children. What wasn't to love? Pediatric anesthesiologists fell in love with ketamine almost immediately. Kids are notoriously difficult to anesthetize. They're scared, they squirm, and their smaller bodies make dosing tricky. Ketamine solved those problems. A single injection, and within minutes, a terrified 5-year-old would go calm and still, ready for surgery. They'd wake up groggy and maybe a little confused, but without the violent nausea that plagued other anesthetics. Parents appreciated the quick recovery times. Doctors appreciated not having to wrestle screaming children onto operating tables. Ketamine made everyone's lives easier. Emergency rooms also embraced ketamine. Trauma patients often arrived in shock with unstable vital signs that made traditional anesthesia dangerous. Ketamine didn't care. You could give it to someone with low blood pressure, someone who was bleeding out, someone whose body was barely holding on, and their breathing would stay intact. ER doctors used it for everything: resetting broken bones, stitching deep wounds, sedating violent or delirious patients. It was versatile, forgiving, and fast. In a chaotic emergency department, those qualities were priceless. In developing countries, ketamine became even more crucial. Many rural hospitals lacked trained anesthesiologists, ventilators, and sophisticated monitoring equipment. Ketamine didn't require any of that. A nurse or general practitioner could administer it safely, even in a bare-bones clinic with intermittent electricity. International aid organizations stocked it in disaster zones and refugee camps. It saved lives in earthquakes, wars, epidemics, places where advanced medicine couldn't reach. Ketamine was the great equalizer, bringing safe anesthesia to the world's most vulnerable populations. For a few glorious years, ketamine's reputation was spotless. It was the anesthetic that did everything right. Medical journals published glowing studies. Hospitals added it to their formularies. Pharmaceutical companies ramped up production to meet growing demand. Ketamine was on track to become one of the most important drugs in modern medicine. But then the whispers started. Doctors began noticing that some patients really enjoyed ketamine, maybe a little too much. A few requested it specifically, claiming they needed it for pain management or anxiety. Emergency room staff reported that certain frequent flyers seemed to fake injuries just to get a ketamine injection. And outside the hospital, word was spreading. Ketamine had a street value now. People were stealing it from clinics, buying it from corrupt suppliers, and using it for decidedly non-medical purposes. The miracle drug, it turned out, had a dark side. But by the time anyone realized it, ketamine had already escaped the operating room and was making its way into the underground. The FDA had approved it, doctors had prescribed it, and now it belonged to everyone, for better and for worse. The genie was out of the bottle, and no amount of regulation was going to put it back. While doctors were using ketamine in operating rooms, a few adventurous psychiatrists started wondering, what if this dissociative state could be therapeutic? In the 1970s, some therapists began experimenting with ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. Patients would receive a controlled dose and then talk through their experiences, often reporting profound insights, emotional breakthroughs, and feelings of ego dissolution. It wasn't exactly legal, and it wasn't exactly mainstream, but word spread quietly through the counterculture and academic circles. Ketamine, it seemed, wasn't just knocking people out, it was opening doors in the mind. The psychedelic therapy movement of the 60s and 70s was already exploring LSD, psilocybin, and MDMA as tools for psychological healing. Therapists believed these substances could help patients access repressed memories, confront trauma, and experience profound shifts in perspective. Then ketamine appeared, and it offered something the classic psychedelics didn't. It was legal, medically approved, and available by prescription. You didn't need to cultivate mushrooms in your basement or rely on shady underground chemists. You could get pharmaceutical-grade ketamine from a hospital pharmacy. A handful of psychiatrists began conducting quiet, off-the-book sessions with ketamine. The protocol was simple. A patient would lie on a couch in a comfortable, dimly lit room. The therapist would administer a sub-anesthetic dose of ketamine, not enough to fully sedate, but enough to induce dissociation. Then the therapist would sit quietly, taking notes, occasionally asking gentle questions. The patient would describe what they were experiencing, floating above their body, reliving childhood memories, confronting inner demons, dissolving into light. Some sessions lasted an hour, Others stretched for 3 or 4. The results were often astonishing. Patients who'd been stuck in talk therapy for years suddenly had breakthroughs. They'd see their problems from new angles, forgive themselves or others, or simply let go of old narratives that had kept them trapped. Some described it as the most important experience of their lives. Others found it too intense, too destabilizing, and never wanted to try it again. But the success stories kept coming, shared in whispered conversations at conferences and in underground therapy networks. One therapist, a maverick psychiatrist in California, treated hundreds of patients with ketamine in the 70s. He believed the drug allowed people to bypass their ego defenses and access deeper layers of the psyche. He compared it to a psychoanalytic shortcut. What might take years of traditional therapy could happen in a single ketamine session. His patients included artists, academics, and even a few curious therapists who wanted to experience it themselves. He documented everything meticulously, hoping one day the medical establishment would take his work seriously. They didn't. Not yet, anyway. The psychiatric community in the 70s was deeply divided over psychedelic therapy. Some saw it as the future of mental health treatment. Others saw it as reckless, dangerous, and ethically questionable. Ketamine-assisted therapy fell into a gray zone. It wasn't explicitly illegal, but it wasn't accepted either. Most therapists who experimented with it did so quietly, knowing their reputations and licenses were on the line. Meanwhile, word spread through the counterculture. People who'd experimented with LSD and mushrooms heard about ketamine and got curious. It offered a different kind of trip, shorter, more controllable, but just as profound. Some sought out therapists who'd work with them. Others obtained ketamine through veterinary connections and experimented on their own. By the late 70s, ketamine had a reputation in psychedelic circles as a powerful tool for inner exploration. But here's the catch. Ketamine therapy in those early days had no standardization, no safety protocols, no peer-reviewed studies backing it up. It was the Wild West of psychiatry, brilliant and reckless in equal measure. Some therapists were skilled, ethical, and genuinely trying to help. Others were opportunists, charging exorbitant fees and offering little more than a drug experience in a room with soft lighting. The line between healing and exploitation was razor thin, and not everyone on the therapeutic side of that line stayed on the right side of it. Still, the seeds were planted. Ketamine wasn't just medicine, it was a key to the mind. And decades later, when science finally caught up, those early rogue therapists would look less like mavericks and more like pioneers. Enter Dr. John C. Lilly, a neuroscientist famous for studying dolphins and building sensory deprivation tanks. Lilly became obsessed with ketamine, using it regularly in his isolation tank experiments. He believed the drug allowed him to communicate with higher intelligences, explore alternate dimensions, and dissolve the boundaries of the self. His writings influenced a generation of psychonauts and inspired countless people to try ketamine in pursuit of mystical experiences. Whether Lilly found enlightenment or just got really high is still up for debate. But his work helped cement ketamine's reputation as more than just a medical tool. It was a portal. John Lilly was already a legend by the time he discovered ketamine. In the 50s and 60s, he'd pioneered research into dolphin communication, built the first sensory deprivation tanks, and conducted experiments on consciousness that straddled the line between science and mysticism. He was brilliant, eccentric, and deeply uninterested in staying within the boundaries of mainstream research. When ketamine appeared in the early 70s, Lilly saw it as the missing piece of his puzzle. His isolation tanks were designed to eliminate all external stimuli. You'd float in body temperature salt water in a pitch-black, soundproof chamber. With no sensory input, your brain would turn inward, sometimes producing vivid hallucinations, profound insights, or existential terror, depending on the person. Lilly had spent hundreds of hours in his tanks, exploring altered states of consciousness. But he wanted to go deeper. Ketamine, he believed, could take him there. He started injecting himself with ketamine before entering the tank. The combination was extraordinary. Freed from both external stimuli and his own bodily awareness, Lilly reported traveling to other dimensions, meeting non-human intelligences, and experiencing states of consciousness he struggled to describe. He called these entities the Earth Coincidence Control Office, or ECHO, cosmic beings who, he believed, guided the evolution of life on Earth. They spoke to him in the tank, gave him instructions, showed him visions of alternate realities. To Lilly, this wasn't hallucination. It was contact. His journals from this period are equal parts fascinating and disturbing. He described complex cosmologies, elaborate belief systems, and encounters with beings made of pure energy. He also described addiction. Lilly used ketamine compulsively, sometimes multiple times a day, for years. His colleagues grew concerned. His wife left him. His health deteriorated. But Lilly kept going, convinced he was on the verge of a breakthrough that would revolutionize humanity's understanding of consciousness. He wrote books about his experiences, and they became underground classics. The Scientist, The Center of the Cyclone, and Programming and Metaprogramming in the Human Biocomputer attracted readers from the psychedelic counterculture, the human potential movement, and the emerging New Age community. Lilly's descriptions of ketamine-induced mystical states inspired thousands of people to seek out the drug for themselves. Some wanted enlightenment, some wanted adventure, some just wanted to see what all the fuss was about. But Lilly's story wasn't a fairy tale. His ketamine use spiraled into full-blown dependency. He suffered physical and cognitive decline, and by the 80s, even he admitted he'd gone too far. In later interviews, he warned people about the dangers of using ketamine recklessly, acknowledging that his experiments had come at a steep personal cost. He'd touched something profound, but he'd also nearly destroyed himself in the process. Still, his influence was undeniable. Lilly legitimized ketamine as a tool for consciousness exploration. He gave it a mythology, a narrative framework that went beyond horse tranquilizer or party drug. Because of Lilly, ketamine became associated with spiritual seeking, cosmic exploration, and the dissolving of boundaries between self and universe. Whether that association was helpful or harmful depends on who you ask. For some, Lilly was a visionary who showed what was possible. For others, he was a cautionary tale about the dangers of mixing science, mysticism, and unregulated drug use. Either way, he ensured that ketamine would never be just medicine again. It was something stranger, something deeper, a molecule that asked questions about reality itself. And once you start asking those questions, you don't always like the answers. By the late 1980s and early 90s, ketamine had escaped the lab, the hospital, and the therapy couch. It found a new home in the underground rave scene. Clubbers discovered that small doses created a floaty, euphoric feeling that paired well with electronic music and strobe lights. It was cheaper than MDMA, easier to find than LSD, and produced a unique, dreamy high. Ravers called it Special K and passed it around in little baggies at warehouse parties from London to Los Angeles. Ketamine was no longer a medicine. It was a vibe. The rave scene of the late 80s was a perfect storm of youth rebellion, musical innovation, and experimental drug use. In abandoned warehouses, illegal outdoor gatherings, and dingy clubs, thousands of young people danced until dawn to pulsing electronic beats. MDMA, or ecstasy, was the drug of choice, empathogenic, euphoric, perfect for losing yourself in music and human connection. But MDMA was getting expensive, supplies were inconsistent, and law enforcement was cracking down. Ravers needed alternatives. Ketamine appeared almost by accident. Someone, probably a veterinary student or a vet tech, with access to clinic supplies, brought a vial to a party. Word spread. It's like MDMA, but weirder. It doesn't make you want to hug everyone, but it makes the music feel like it's coming from inside your skull. Colors get brighter, the bass goes deeper, time becomes irrelevant. And unlike MDMA, which could leave you emotionally drained for days, ketamine's come down was relatively gentle. You just felt fuzzy, disconnected, but not bad. Small doses became the key. Take too much ketamine and you're incapacitated, lying on a couch unable to move while the universe collapses around you. But take just a little, a bump, a key-sized snort, and you get a floaty, dreamy sensation that doesn't stop you from dancing. It became a party enhancer, something to sprinkle on top of the main event. People would do a line of ketamine, step onto the dance floor, and feel the music differently, deeper, stranger, more alien. It was like dancing inside a kaleidoscope. The nickname Special K caught on quickly, a cheeky reference to the breakfast cereal, but also a nod to the drug's unique, hard-to-describe effects. Dealers started carrying it alongside MDMA, LSD, and speed. Some ravers mixed it with other drugs. Ketamine and MDMA together created a combination called kitty flipping, a disorienting but euphoric experience. Ketamine and cocaine was called Calvin Klein. These combos became part of rave culture's pharmacological folklore, passed down through word of mouth and scribbled on bathroom walls. By the early 90s, ketamine had spread from London's acid house scene to clubs in Ibiza, Berlin, New York, and San Francisco. It wasn't the star of the show, that was still MDMA, but it was a reliable supporting character. DJs sometimes used it to stay alert during marathon sets. Promoters used it to take the edge off when the party was winding down. And ravers used it because, well, it was there, it was cheap, and it made the 4 a.m. come down a little more bearable. But ketamine's presence in rave culture wasn't all peace and love. The drug's dissociative effects made it a favorite for predators. Someone on too much ketamine couldn't fight back, couldn't run, could barely speak. Sexual assaults at raves increased, and ketamine was often involved. The same properties that made it useful in hospitals, sedation without respiratory depression, made it dangerous in unsupervised environments. People passed out in corners, wandered into traffic, or got separated from their friends and ended up in dangerous situations. Still, for many ravers, ketamine was just part of the landscape. It wasn't the hero or the villain, it was just another tool in the pharmacological toolkit. You took it, you floated for a while, you came back. Simple. Except, of course, when it wasn't. Because ketamine had a habit of taking people places they weren't prepared to go. And once you went too deep, there was no turning back, only the K-hole, waiting like a trap door under the dance floor. But we'll get to that next. Not everyone at the rave was just looking for a mellow buzz. Some people took too much ketamine, way too much, and ended up in what users called the K-hole. Imagine being unable to move, speak, or fully grasp where or who you are. Time stops making sense. Reality becomes liquid. For some, it's terrifying. For others, it's the most profound experience of their lives. The K-hole became both a cautionary tale and a rite of passage in the party scene. One thing was certain: if you fell into the K-hole, you weren't dancing your way out. The K-hole isn't a place, it's a state of mind. Technically, it's what happens when you take enough ketamine to fully dissociate from your body and surroundings. Your sense of self dissolves. Your connection to physical reality snaps like a rubber band. What's left is something else. Some people describe it as floating in space, untethered from time and identity. Others describe it as being trapped inside a dark tunnel, falling endlessly, unable to scream. A few describe it as ego death, the complete annihilation of the I, leaving only pure consciousness. From the outside, someone in the K-hole looks catatonic. Their eyes are open, but blank. They don't respond to their name. If you shake them, they might twitch slightly, but they're not really there. Their body is a shell, and wherever their mind went, it's not coming back for a while, usually 30 minutes to an hour, though it can feel like an eternity from the inside. Friends learn to recognize the signs. Someone who was dancing a minute ago is now slumped in a corner, staring at nothing, drooling slightly. Welcome to the K-hole. For some people, the K-hole is a spiritual experience. They emerge talking about cosmic unity, divine love, and the interconnectedness of all things. They describe meeting entities, traveling through other dimensions, or experiencing a rebirth of consciousness. These people often seek out the K-hole intentionally, viewing it as a shortcut to the kind of mystical experiences that might otherwise require years of meditation or massive doses of classic psychedelics. They call it a breakthrough, and they'll tell you it changed their life. For others, the K-hole is a nightmare. They describe panic, confusion, a crushing sense of dread. Some feel like they're dying, stuck in a loop where their last thought repeats infinitely, trapped in a recursive hell. Others experience terrifying hallucinations, walls closing in, shadowy figures, the sensation of being buried alive. When they finally resurface, they're shaking, crying, traumatized. They swear they'll never touch ketamine again. Some keep that promise, many don't. The problem is, you can't predict which kind of K-hole you'll get. There's no way to know if you'll meet God or meet your worst nightmare. It depends on your mindset, your environment, your personal psychology, and probably some neurochemical variables science hasn't figured out yet. Even experienced users report wildly different K-hole experiences from one trip to the next. It's a roll of the dice every single time. In rave culture, the K-hole became legendary. People swapped stories like war veterans comparing scars. I K-holed at Coachella and saw the entire history of the universe. I K-holed in a bathroom stall and thought I was a lamp for 2 hours. The stories were funny, horrifying, and deeply strange. But beneath the bravado, there was an undercurrent of fear. Everyone knew someone who'd K-holed and come back different, quieter, more withdrawn, like they'd seen something they couldn't unsee. There were practical dangers too. People in K-holes couldn't consent, couldn't protect themselves, couldn't call for help. If they vomited, they might aspirate and choke. If they wandered, they might fall, get hit by a car, or end up in dangerous situations. Rave culture developed informal safety protocols. If someone K-holes, lay them on their side, watch their breathing, Keep them away from stairs and traffic, and wait it out. Don't call an ambulance unless absolutely necessary. The drug would wear off on its own, and involving authorities could mean arrests, charges, and a criminal record. The K-hole was recreational roulette. Sometimes you won, an ego-shattering, perspective-shifting, unforgettable experience. Sometimes you lost, a terrifying, disorienting, traumatic hour you'd spend years trying to forget. And sometimes you just landed somewhere in between, neither enlightened nor destroyed, just confused. Either way, once you'd been there, you never forgot it. The K-hole left a mark, and for some people that mark looked like wisdom. For others, it looked like a scar. Where was all this party ketamine coming from? A lot of it was stolen or diverted from veterinary clinics. Vets still used ketamine regularly on animals, and it wasn't as tightly controlled as other drugs. Break into a vet's office, grab a few vials, and suddenly you've got enough Special K to supply a festival. Law enforcement started noticing the pattern, and by the mid-90s, regulations tightened. But the damage was done. Ketamine had firmly established itself in the recreational drug market. In the early 90s, if you wanted ketamine, you didn't go to a street dealer. You went to someone who knew someone who worked at a vet clinic. Veterinary offices were treasure troves of pharmaceutical-grade ketamine, often stored in unlocked cabinets or poorly secured refrigerators. Security was lax because, frankly, who robs a vet? People loved animals. Vet clinics were respected, trusted community institutions. Nobody expected them to become the primary source of an emerging party drug. But they did. Vet techs, assistants, and even some veterinarians themselves started noticing that ketamine had street value, serious street value. A single 10 milliliter vial, which might cost the clinic $20 wholesale, could be sold for hundreds on the black market. It was too tempting. Some people stole small amounts, just enough to sell to friends or bring to parties. Others ran full-scale operations, systematically siphoning off supplies and selling them to dealers. A few veterinarians got involved directly, writing fake prescriptions or deliberately over-ordering ketamine to create surplus they could divert. Breaking into vet clinics became surprisingly common. Thieves weren't after cash or expensive equipment. They wanted the drug cabinets. Police started seeing a pattern: smashed windows, ransacked supply rooms, but the only things missing were vials of ketamine and sometimes opioids. It was weird, brazen, and incredibly difficult to prevent. You couldn't exactly put armed guards at every small-town animal hospital. The problem was compounded by poor record-keeping. Many clinics didn't track ketamine usage meticulously because it was a Schedule III drug, regulated, but not as strictly as Schedule II, substances like morphine. A missing vial here and there often went unnoticed. Even when clinic managers suspected theft, they were reluctant to call the police. Vet clinics depend on community trust, and admitting you'd been robbed, or worse, that an employee was stealing, could damage your reputation. So many thefts went unreported, and the supply kept flowing. By the mid-90s, law enforcement agencies finally connected the dots. The DEA issued warnings, urging veterinary clinics to improve security and monitor ketamine supplies more carefully. Some states introduced stricter regulations, requiring detailed logs of every dose administered or dispensed. Clinics installed safes, alarm systems, and surveillance cameras. A few veterinarians lost their licenses after being caught diverting drugs, but the regulations came too late. By the time authorities cracked down, ketamine had already saturated the recreational market. The supply chain had diversified. While vet clinics were still a source, ketamine was now being synthesized in underground labs, imported from overseas, and distributed through established drug networks. Closing the veterinary loophole helped, but it didn't stop the flow. The irony is painful. The same drug that made veterinary medicine safer and more humane ended up fueling a black market that put both humans and animals at risk. Clinics struggled to maintain adequate supplies while dealing with theft and regulatory scrutiny. Some vets stopped using ketamine altogether, switching to alternative anesthetics that were less effective, but also less likely to disappear from their shelves. And the people using stolen vet-grade ketamine at raves? Most had no idea where it came from. They didn't think about the vet tech who lost their job, the clinic that got robbed, or the animals whose surgeries were delayed because supplies ran out. They just knew it was pure, it was cheap, and it worked. The supply chain problem wasn't their problem until, of course, the supply dried up, or the purity dropped, and people started getting hurt. But by then, ketamine had already become woven into the fabric of party culture, and there was no unweaving it. By the late 1990s, the DEA had seen enough. Ketamine was showing up everywhere. Raves, clubs, college campuses, even high schools. In 1999, they classified it as a Schedule III controlled substance, the same category as anabolic steroids and certain barbiturates. This meant stricter regulations, harsher penalties for illegal possession, and mandatory record keeping for anyone prescribing or dispensing it. The goal was to crack down on diversion and recreational use, while still allowing legitimate medical applications. Did it work? Sort of. It slowed things down, but didn't stop them. The DEA's decision to schedule ketamine came after years of mounting evidence. Emergency rooms were seeing more ketamine-related incidents. Police were confiscating it at parties and traffic stops. Youth drug surveys showed rising use among teenagers and young adults. The agency held hearings, reviewed data, consulted with medical professionals, and ultimately concluded that ketamine had a potential for abuse that warranted federal control. Critics argued that scheduling would restrict legitimate medical use. The DEA countered that doctors could still prescribe it. They'd just have to follow stricter protocols. Schedule III status meant several things. First, anyone caught with ketamine without a prescription could face criminal charges, up to a year in prison for first-time possession, more for distribution. Second, pharmacies had to maintain detailed records of every ketamine prescription filled, creating a paper trail that made diversion harder. Third, doctors who prescribed it had to register with the DEA and follow specific guidelines. And fourth, manufacturers had to report production numbers and track where every vial ended up. On paper, it looked like a comprehensive crackdown. In practice, the results were mixed. Legitimate medical use continued without major disruptions. Hospitals still stocked ketamine for emergency medicine and anesthesia. Veterinarians adjusted their record keeping and moved on. But recreational use? That barely slowed down. The people who wanted ketamine for parties found ways to get it. Some turned to online pharmacies, which were just emerging in the early 2000s and operated in legal gray zones. Others relied on international suppliers who shipped ketamine from countries where regulations were looser. A few turned to underground chemists who synthesized it in clandestine labs. Law enforcement did make arrests. Dealers got caught, users got charged, and a few high-profile cases made headlines. In 2000, a major ketamine trafficking ring was busted in California. Dozens of arrests, thousands of vials seized, connections to organized crime. The DEA held press conferences, declared victory, and promised continued vigilance. But for every dealer taken down, 2 more popped up. The demand was too strong, the profits too high, and the supply chain too adaptable. One unintended consequence of scheduling was price inflation. When ketamine was easy to steal from vet clinics, it was cheap, sometimes $5 or $10 a dose. After Schedule III classification, prices doubled, then tripled. Higher prices meant higher profits for dealers, which attracted more sophisticated criminal organizations. Ketamine went from being a quirky party drug handled by small-time operators to a commodity worth the attention of serious traffickers. The DEA had tried to reduce harm by limiting access, but instead they'd made the market more profitable and more dangerous. Another issue was inconsistent enforcement. Schedule III drugs occupy an awkward middle ground, more serious than marijuana, less serious than heroin or cocaine. Prosecutors often prioritized higher-level offenses, so ketamine cases sometimes got plea bargained down or dropped entirely. Users caught with small amounts might get probation, community service, or drug education classes instead of jail time. The threat of punishment existed, but it wasn't consistent enough to be a real deterrent. Still, scheduling had symbolic importance. It signaled that the government was paying attention, that ketamine wasn't going to be ignored or tolerated. It also provided a legal framework for future enforcement efforts. When ketamine use spiked again in the 2010s, this time in the context of depression treatment and wellness clinics, the Schedule III classification was already in place, ready to be enforced or modified as needed. The DEA's intervention didn't end ketamine's recreational career, but it did change the game. The drug became harder to obtain legally, more expensive on the street, and riskier to possess. Some users moved on to other substances. Others doubled down, viewing the legal risks as part of the adventure. And a very few, stopped and wondered if maybe, just maybe, the DEA had a point. But those people were definitely in the minority. As regulations tightened in the United States, underground manufacturers stepped up. Many operated in China, where pharmaceutical production was booming and oversight was inconsistent. Clandestine labs synthesized ketamine in bulk, often with varying purity and questionable quality control. They shipped it internationally, hidden in innocuous packages or mislabeled as other chemicals. This gray market ketamine flooded the recreational drug market, making it cheaper and more accessible than ever. The catch? You never really knew what you were getting. China's rise as a pharmaceutical manufacturing powerhouse in the late 90s and early 2000s created perfect conditions for underground ketamine production. The country had the infrastructure, trained chemists, sophisticated lab equipment, chemical precursors, and the anonymity. Thousands of legitimate pharmaceutical companies operated side by side with less scrupulous operations. Some manufacturers produced ketamine legally for export to licensed medical facilities. Others produced it illegally for export to anyone willing to pay, no questions asked. The synthesis of ketamine isn't particularly difficult if you have the right equipment and knowledge. It doesn't require exotic precursors or complex multi-step processes like some other drugs. A competent chemist with access to basic lab supplies can make it. Chinese underground labs churned out kilogram after kilogram, packaging it for international distribution. Some labs operated semi-openly, advertising on gray market websites and accepting orders via email. Others were fully clandestine, known only through encrypted channels and personal referrals. Quality control was a major problem. Legitimate pharmaceutical ketamine is produced under strict standards, purity above 99%, sterile conditions, rigorous testing. Underground ketamine? Not so much. Purity could range from 50 to 95%, with the remainder being unknown adulterants, synthesis byproducts, or cutting agents. Some batches were perfectly fine. Others contained contaminants that caused unexpected side effects, nausea, burning sensations, strange odors, or worse. A few batches were dangerously impure, containing toxic compounds that could cause kidney damage or seizures. Shipping was the next challenge. How do you move hundreds of kilograms of illegal drugs from China to customers around the world? Underground manufacturers got creative. They mislabeled packages as research chemicals or industrial solvents. They hid ketamine in shipments of legitimate goods, electronics, clothing, auto parts. They used fake company names and forged customs documents. And they exploited the sheer volume of international trade. Millions of packages flow between China and the rest of the world every day. And customs officials can only inspect a tiny fraction. By the early 2000s, Chinese ketamine had saturated the market. Dealers in the United States, Europe, and Australia could order directly from suppliers, cutting out middlemen and maximizing profits. Some buyers were small-time dealers supplying local party scenes. Others were large-scale distributors moving hundreds of kilograms. Prices dropped dramatically. What once cost $100 a gram now cost $20. The lower prices made ketamine accessible to a wider audience, including younger users with limited budgets. But cheap ketamine came with risks. Users had no way to verify purity or composition. A bag of powder labeled ketamine might be 90% ketamine and 10% mystery substance. Or it might be 50-50. Or it might not be ketamine at all. Scammers sometimes sold other white powders, anything from baking soda to research chemicals, and called it ketamine. Testing kits existed, but most users didn't bother. They trusted their dealers, crossed their fingers, and hoped for the best. Law enforcement struggled to keep up. Shutting down one Chinese lab meant nothing when a dozen others were still operating. International cooperation was complicated by jurisdictional issues, language barriers, and differing legal standards. Chinese authorities occasionally cracked down on underground pharmaceutical manufacturers, but the operations were so widespread and decentralized that enforcement felt like playing whack-a-mole. Shut down one lab, another pops up in a different province. The China connection also created a weird inversion of the traditional drug trade. Historically, drugs flowed from developing countries to wealthy Western markets. Cocaine from South America, heroin from Southeast Asia. But with ketamine, a wealthy industrialized country was supplying drugs to the rest of the world. It was pharmaceutical globalization in its darkest form, proof that in the modern economy, anything can be manufactured and exported, legal or not. By the time authorities fully recognized the scope of the problem, underground Chinese ketamine had become entrenched. It was the default supply for recreational users worldwide. Veterinary diversion still happened, but it was a drop in the bucket compared to the industrial-scale production happening overseas. The cat was out of the bag, the genie was out of the bottle, and the ketamine was out of the lab, and there was no putting it back. While ketamine was making headlines in the party scene, something unexpected happened in research labs. In the early 2000s, psychiatrists discovered that ketamine could relieve severe depression, fast. We're talking hours, not weeks like traditional antidepressants. Patients who'd been suicidal, hopeless, and treatment-resistant suddenly felt better after a single infusion. It was shocking, unprecedented, and scientifically baffling. Nobody understood exactly how or why it worked, but the results were undeniable. Ketamine, the horse tranquilizer turned party drug, was suddenly a potential lifesaver. The story begins at Yale University in the early 2000s. Researchers were exploring alternatives to traditional antidepressants, which worked by targeting serotonin, dopamine, or norepinephrine. These drugs helped many people but had significant limitations. They took weeks to work, came with unpleasant side effects, and failed completely in about a third of patients. Psychiatrists desperately needed new options, especially for treatment-resistant depression, the kind that didn't respond to anything. A research team led by Dr. John Crystal decided to investigate ketamine. They knew the drug affected glutamate, a neurotransmitter involved in learning, memory, and neural plasticity. They suspected that manipulating glutamate might offer a new approach to treating depression. In 2000, they published a small study. 7 patients with major depression received a single intravenous infusion of ketamine. Within hours, 4 of them showed significant improvement. Within 24 hours, all 7 reported reduced depressive symptoms. It was the fastest antidepressant response ever documented. The findings were met with skepticism. A single small study proved nothing. Maybe it was placebo effect. Maybe the patients were just high and mistook euphoria for genuine improvement. Critics pointed out that ketamine was a dissociative drug. Of course, people felt better temporarily. They were literally detached from their problems. But the researchers pushed back. The antidepressant effects lasted days, sometimes weeks, long after the acute dissociative effects wore off. Something deeper was happening. More studies followed, each confirming the original findings. Ketamine worked fast, sometimes within hours. It worked on treatment-resistant patients who'd failed multiple other medications. And most remarkably, it seemed to reduce suicidal ideation almost immediately. For patients in acute crisis, this was revolutionary. Traditional antidepressants could take 4 to 6 weeks to work, during which time suicidal patients were at extreme risk. Ketamine offered a bridge, a way to pull someone back from the edge while longer-term treatments took effect. The medical community was stunned. Here was a drug that had been around since the 60s, approved for anesthesia, widely available, dirt cheap, and apparently one of the most effective, rapid-acting antidepressants ever discovered. How had everyone missed this? The answer was complicated. Ketamine had been pigeonholed as an anesthetic, then stigmatized as a party drug. Nobody thought to study it systematically for psychiatric conditions until researchers started thinking outside the serotonin box. But there were problems. Ketamine infusions required medical supervision. You couldn't just hand someone a prescription and send them home. The dissociative effects were unsettling for some patients. The antidepressant effects were temporary, usually lasting a week or 2, which meant patients needed repeated infusions. And nobody knew the long-term effects of regular ketamine use for depression. The chronic users from the party scene weren't exactly glowing examples of long-term brain health. Still, for psychiatrists treating severely depressed patients, ketamine was a game changer. It gave them a tool for emergencies, a way to buy time, a last resort when everything else had failed. Clinics started offering ketamine infusions off-label. Doctors could prescribe it because it was FDA approved, just not specifically for depression. Patients paid out of pocket, sometimes hundreds of dollars per session, but many felt it was worth it. The alternative was continued suffering, or, in some cases, death. The scientific community scrambled to understand the mechanism. How did blocking NMDA receptors lead to rapid antidepressant effects? The leading theory involved glutamate surges, triggering brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF, which promoted new neural connections and essentially rewired depressive thought patterns. It was elegant, plausible, and supported by animal studies, but the full picture remained murky. What was clear, though, was that ketamine had completed an astonishing comeback. From battlefield anesthetic to horse tranquilizer to party drug to psychiatric medication, the journey was bizarre, but the science was solid. Ketamine worked, and for the first time in decades, researchers had a genuinely new approach to treating depression. The question now was, could they harness ketamine's therapeutic potential without unleashing its darker sides? The pharmaceutical industry was about to find out. In 2019, the FDA approved esketamine, a nasal spray version of ketamine marketed under the brand name Spravato by Johnson & Johnson. Esketamine is chemically similar to ketamine but uses only one of its two molecular mirror images, the S enantiomer, which supposedly has stronger antidepressant effects with fewer side effects. It was the first truly new type of antidepressant approved in decades, and it came with a hefty price tag. Suddenly, ketamine wasn't just a generic drug. It was a patented, profitable pharmaceutical product. Big Pharma had entered the chat. Johnson & Johnson saw an opportunity. Regular ketamine was cheap, generic, and unpatentable. Anyone could make it. But esketamine, that was different. By isolating the S enantiomer and developing a nasal spray delivery system, they created a product they could patent and control. They conducted expensive clinical trials, navigated the FDA approval process, and positioned Spravato as a breakthrough treatment for treatment-resistant depression. It was brilliant business strategy. The FDA approval came with restrictions. If Spravato couldn't be taken at home, patients had to receive it in certified medical facilities under supervision. After each dose, they had to be monitored for at least 2 hours to watch for adverse reactions like dissociation, sedation, or dangerously elevated blood pressure. This was partly for safety and partly to prevent diversion. Nobody wanted a legally prescribed ketamine product flooding the recreational market. The restrictions made Spravato expensive and logistically complicated, but also medically defensible. Insurance companies were skeptical. Was Spravato really better than generic ketamine infusions? The clinical trials showed modest improvements in some patients, but the differences weren't dramatic. Generic ketamine infusions cost a few $100s. Spravato cost thousands per month, plus the overhead of supervised administration. Some insurers refused to cover it, arguing it wasn't cost-effective. Others covered it only after patients had tried and failed multiple other treatments. Access became a major issue. Psychiatrists were divided. Some welcomed Spravato as a convenient FDA-approved option that gave them legal cover to use ketamine-based treatments. Others saw it as unnecessary medicalization of a drug that already worked fine in generic form. Why prescribe an expensive nasal spray when you could use cheaper intravenous ketamine off-label? The debate got heated, with accusations of pharmaceutical industry influence on one side and concerns about unsafe off-label use on the other. Patients had mixed experiences. Some loved Spravato. The nasal spray was less intimidating than an IV, and the supervised setting felt safe. Others found it disappointing. The effects weren't as strong as they'd hoped, or the logistics were too burdensome, or their insurance wouldn't cover it. A few experienced unpleasant side effects. Dizziness, nausea, dissociation so intense they couldn't function for hours. And there were always the people who wondered, am I getting better? Or am I just getting high twice a week? Johnson & Johnson marketed Spravato aggressively. They sponsored conferences, funded continuing medical education for psychiatrists, and published glossy materials highlighting clinical trial results. Critics accused them of disease-mongering, exaggerating the prevalence of treatment-resistant depression to expand their market. Supporters argued they were simply educating doctors about a legitimate treatment option. The truth, as usual, was somewhere in between. One thing was certain. Spravato transformed ketamine's image. It went from that horse tranquilizer people do at raves to FDA-approved psychiatric medication. News articles about ketamine shifted from crime reports to health features. Medical conferences that once ignored ketamine now devoted entire symposia to it. The drug had been sanitized, medicalized, rebranded. It was respectable now. But the underlying molecule was still ketamine. Esketamine worked through the same mechanisms, affected the same receptors, produced the same dissociative effects. The difference was packaging, a nasal spray instead of an injection, a prescription pad instead of a baggie, a medical clinic instead of a warehouse rave. Johnson & Johnson had taken a 60-year-old generic drug, given it a makeover, and sold it back to the world at a premium price. Was Spravato a cynical cash grab or a genuine innovation? Probably both. It made ketamine treatment more accessible for some patients while making it prohibitively expensive for others. It legitimized ketamine-based therapy while also restricting access through regulatory requirements. It advanced psychiatric medicine while also enriching shareholders. In other words, it was exactly what you'd expect when Big Pharma discovers a miracle drug that's been hiding in plain sight for decades. The miracle was real. The price tag was too. Following Spravato's approval, ketamine clinics exploded across the United States. Some were legitimate psychiatric practices offering evidence-based treatment for depression and PTSD. Others were glorified spas, offering transformative experiences with soft lighting, meditation music, and eye masks. Prices ranged from a few hundred to several $1,000s per session, rarely covered by insurance. It was the Wild West of psychiatry. Some clinics changed lives, others just emptied wallets. Regulation struggled to keep pace with the boom. The first ketamine clinics appeared in the early 2010s, before Spravato existed, offering off-label ketamine infusions for depression. They were typically run by anesthesiologists or psychiatrists who'd read the research and wanted to help treatment-resistant patients. These early clinics were careful, conservative, medically rigorous. They screened patients thoroughly, monitored vital signs during infusions, provided integration therapy afterward, and followed up diligently. They weren't trying to get rich. They were trying to offer a treatment that mainstream psychiatry had ignored. Then Spravato got FDA approval, and everything changed. Suddenly, ketamine therapy was legitimate, newsworthy, trendy. Clinics started popping up in strip malls, wellness centers, and upscale neighborhoods. Some were opened by experienced psychiatrists. Others were opened by entrepreneurs with minimal psychiatric training who saw a lucrative opportunity. The quality and ethics varied wildly. At the best clinics, you'd find board-certified psychiatrists, detailed intake evaluations, standardized dosing protocols, cardiovascular monitoring, and follow-up therapy sessions. They treated ketamine as serious medicine for serious conditions. They turned away patients who weren't good candidates, They coordinated with patients' existing mental health providers. They tracked outcomes and adjusted treatment plans based on results. These clinics genuinely helped people, sometimes dramatically. At the worst clinics, you'd find minimal screening, cookie-cutter protocols, and a business model focused on maximizing sessions per day. Some pushed patients to sign up for expensive multi-session packages up front. Others offered ketamine for vague indications like personal growth or spiritual exploration, skirting the line between medical treatment and recreational drug use. A few advertised ketamine as a cure-all for everything from anxiety to chronic pain to relationship problems, making claims unsupported by evidence. The aesthetic divide was telling. Legitimate psychiatric clinics looked like medical offices, sterile, professional, maybe a bit drab. The spa-style clinics looked like yoga studios, dim lighting, essential oil diffusers, plush recliners, new age music, and staff who spoke about journeys and healing in hushed, reverent tones. Both models had their place, but the spa approach made some medical professionals deeply uncomfortable. Was this still medicine, or had it crossed into something else? Price transparency was a major issue. Ketamine infusions weren't standardized, so clinics could charge whatever they wanted. Some charged $300 per session. Others charged $2,000. Patients rarely knew if they were paying for medical expertise or just overhead and marketing. And because insurance rarely covered ketamine for depression, patients paid out of pocket, often draining savings or going into debt for treatment. Regulation lagged behind. Ketamine was legal to prescribe off-label, so doctors had wide latitude in how they used it. State medical boards couldn't easily distinguish between legitimate psychiatric practice and questionable profiteering. By the time regulators started asking questions, is this doctor qualified? Are patients being exploited? Are outcomes being tracked? Dozens of clinics were already operating. Patient experiences varied enormously. Some people found ketamine therapy life-changing. They emerged from years of depression, reconnected with joy, rebuilt their lives. They'd tell anyone who'd listen that ketamine saved them. Others felt exploited. They paid thousands of dollars, experienced temporary relief, followed by relapse, and ended up no better off than when they started. A few suffered harm, dissociation so severe they struggled to integrate back into daily life, psychological dependence on the treatments, or adverse reactions that weren't properly managed. The ketamine clinic boom also created strange cultural moments. Celebrities started talking about their ketamine therapy experiences. Glossy magazine profiles featured entrepreneurs and artists who credited ketamine with unlocking creativity. Social media filled with testimonials, think pieces, and debates about whether ketamine was medicine, wellness, or indulgence. The line between healing and hype blurred until it was almost invisible. By the early 2020s, thousands of ketamine clinics operated across the country, forming a multi-million-dollar industry. Some provided essential care to desperate patients. Others capitalized on suffering and hope, offering expensive treatments of dubious value. Most fell somewhere in between, trying to do good, trying to make money, and not always sure how to balance the two. The question remained, was this the future of psychiatry or just another gold rush? Time would tell. But for now, ketamine clinics were everywhere, and business was booming. So, what's actually happening in your brain when you take ketamine? Unlike most antidepressants that target serotonin, ketamine blocks NMDA receptors, which are involved in glutamate signaling. This blockage triggers a surge of glutamate release, which in turn activates other receptors and promotes the growth of new neural connections. It's like giving your brain a temporary reboot. Old depressive thought patterns get disrupted and new pathways form. This explains both the dissociative effects and the antidepressant properties. Your brain is literally rewiring itself, and consciousness goes a bit haywire in the process. Let's start with the basics. Your brain runs on neurotransmitters, chemical messengers that carry signals between neurons. Serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine get most of the attention in psychiatry, but glutamate is actually the brain's primary excitatory neurotransmitter. It's involved in learning, memory, cognition, and neural plasticity. Glutamate makes things happen in the brain. It's the accelerator pedal of consciousness. NMDA receptors are one type of glutamate receptor, and they're crucial for synaptic plasticity, the brain's ability to form new connections and reorganize itself. When glutamate binds to NMDA receptors, it allows calcium to flow into neurons, triggering cascades of molecular events that strengthen or weaken synaptic connections. This is how learning happens, how memories form, how the brain adapts to experience. Ketamine blocks NMDA receptors. It sits in the receptor channel and prevents glutamate from doing its normal job. You'd think this would slow brain activity down, but the opposite happens. Blocking NMDA receptors causes a paradoxical surge of glutamate release. The brain essentially freaks out, dumping extra glutamate into the synaptic gaps between neurons. This glutamate flood activates other receptors, AMPA receptors, which trigger a cascade of molecular events. One key player is BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. Think of it as fertilizer for neurons. The glutamate surge triggers BDNF release, which promotes the growth of new dendritic spines, the tiny protrusions where neurons form connections with each other. More spines mean more potential connections, more neural plasticity, more capacity for change. This is critical because depression is associated with reduced synaptic density in certain brain regions, particularly the prefrontal cortex. Ketamine, by promoting new connections, essentially reverses this atrophy. The dissociative effects, those happen because ketamine disrupts normal communication between different brain regions. Your sense of self, your perception of your body, your awareness of time and space, these all depend on synchronized activity across multiple brain networks. Ketamine throws a wrench into that synchronization. The brain regions still work individually, but they're no longer coordinating properly. The result is dissociation, the feeling of being detached from your body, your thoughts, your environment, or reality itself. Brain imaging studies show that ketamine reduces activity in the default mode network, a group of brain regions active during rest and self-referential thinking. The default mode network is where your sense of I lives, your autobiography, your worries about the future, your ruminations about the past. In depression, the default mode network often becomes hyperactive, trapping people in loops of negative self-talk and hopelessness. Ketamine quiets that network, temporarily dissolving the rigid sense of self that depression reinforces. But here's the mystery: the acute effects of ketamine, the dissociation, the glutamate surge, the receptor blockade only last a few hours. Yet the antidepressant effects persist for days or weeks. Why? The current hypothesis is that ketamine creates a window of opportunity. By promoting new neural connections and disrupting old patterns, it gives the brain a chance to reorganize itself in healthier ways. It's like hitting the reset button. The immediate effect is disorienting, but the long-term result can be transformative. There's also growing evidence that ketamine affects inflammation and stress pathways. Chronic stress and inflammation are linked to depression, and ketamine seems to interrupt those processes. It may reduce inflammatory markers in the brain and reverse the neurological damage caused by chronic stress. These mechanisms are still being studied, but they suggest ketamine works through multiple pathways simultaneously. Of course, all of this is still somewhat speculative. Neuroscience is complicated, and we're far from fully understanding how ketamine produces its effects. What we know for sure is that it does something fundamentally different from traditional antidepressants. It's faster, it works through different mechanisms, and it requires the brain to rewire itself. The dissociation isn't a side effect. It's part of the process. Your consciousness has to go offline briefly so the brain can do its rewiring work. And when you come back, if everything goes right, you're different. Not just chemically, but structurally. Your brain has changed, and so have you. Ketamine isn't physically addictive in the way heroin or alcohol is. You won't get withdrawal seizures or life-threatening symptoms if you stop. But psychological dependence is absolutely real. Chronic users describe craving the dissociation, the escape from reality, the sense of floating free from problems and responsibilities. Over time, heavy use causes serious harm. Bladder damage so severe it requires surgery, cognitive impairment, memory problems, and social isolation. The party drug has a body count, even if it doesn't kill you directly. Let's talk about what happens when ketamine use stops being recreational and becomes compulsive. It starts innocently enough. Someone enjoys the effects, uses it at parties, maybe once a week, then twice, then more. They start using it alone, not just socially. They use it to deal with stress, boredom, or emotional pain. Before they realize it, ketamine has become a coping mechanism, and they're psychologically dependent. The craving isn't for physical relief. Ketamine doesn't cause painful withdrawal symptoms like opioids do. The craving is for psychological escape. Life feels too hard, too heavy, too real. Ketamine offers a vacation from consciousness, and for people struggling with trauma, anxiety, or depression, that vacation becomes incredibly appealing. They start chasing the K-hole, seeking that complete dissolution of self where nothing matters and everything is bearable. Tolerance develops quickly. The dose that once produced profound dissociation now barely takes the edge off. Users escalate. More ketamine, more often, higher doses. Some people end up using daily, sometimes multiple times a day. At this point, they're not getting high anymore. They're just avoiding sobriety. The dissociation becomes baseline, and normal consciousness feels intolerable. Then the physical consequences start appearing. The most notorious is ketamine bladder, a painful condition where chronic use causes severe inflammation and scarring of the urinary tract. Sufferers experience constant urgency, burning pain, blood in urine, and incontinence. In severe cases, the bladder shrinks to a fraction of its normal size and loses all function, requiring surgical removal and permanent urostomy bags. It's excruciating, humiliating, and often irreversible. The mechanism isn't fully understood, but ketamine and its metabolites appear to be directly toxic to the bladder lining. Chronic exposure causes ulceration, fibrosis, and eventually complete destruction of bladder tissue. Doctors first noticed the pattern in Asian countries where ketamine use was epidemic and initially didn't believe it. How could an anesthetic destroy bladders? But the evidence became undeniable. Chronic users, some as young as their 20s, were showing up with bladders resembling those of 90-year-old cancer patients. Cognitive effects are equally concerning. Heavy ketamine users show impairments in memory, attention, and executive function. They struggle to learn new information, forget conversations, lose track of responsibilities. MRI studies reveal actual changes in brain structure, reduced gray matter in the prefrontal cortex and other regions critical for cognition. Some of these changes reverse with abstinence, others appear permanent. Then there's the social cost. Chronic users often withdraw from friends and family. They lose jobs because they're too cognitively impaired or too dissociated to function. Relationships crumble because their partners can't compete with ketamine's emotional numbness. They stop caring about hobbies, goals, or anything beyond their next dose. Life narrows to a pinpoint. Get ketamine, use ketamine, recover enough to do it again. The psychological dependence creates its own trap. Many chronic users recognize they have a problem but can't imagine life without ketamine. The drug has become their primary coping mechanism, their social lubricant, their escape hatch. Quitting means confronting all the pain, anxiety, and trauma they've been avoiding. That prospect is terrifying, so they keep using, even as their bodies and minds deteriorate. Treatment options are limited. There's no ketamine-specific rehab protocol, no maintenance medication like methadone for opioids. Treatment usually involves standard addiction approaches: therapy, support groups, psychiatric medication for underlying conditions, and time. Some people quit successfully, others relapse repeatedly. A few never quit and eventually suffer catastrophic consequences: destroyed bladders, permanent cognitive impairment, complete social isolation. The irony is devastating. Ketamine is being researched as a treatment for various addictions, alcoholism, cocaine dependence. Yet ketamine itself can be addictive. The drug that helps some people can destroy others. The same dissociation that provides therapeutic relief in clinical settings becomes a prison for chronic users. The line between medicine and poison, between healing and harm, comes down to dose, frequency, context, and individual vulnerability. Cross that line, and ketamine stops being a tool and becomes a trap. And getting out of that trap is one of the hardest things anyone can do. By the 2010s, ketamine had become embedded in festival culture worldwide. Burning Man, Coachella, Glastonbury, Tomorrowland. Ketamine was there, part of the landscape, as common as overpriced water and undercooked food trucks. It appeared in song lyrics, art installations, an internet trip, reports. People documented their K-holes on Reddit and Erowid, sharing insights and warnings in equal measure. Ketamine had transcended its origins to become a cultural artifact, a shared reference point, a drug with mythology and meaning beyond its molecular structure. The festival circuit became ketamine's natural habitat. Electronic music festivals especially embraced it. The dreamy, dissociative effects paired beautifully with ambient soundscapes and visual projections. At Burning Man, the annual countercultural gathering in Nevada's Black Rock Desert, ketamine was practically an institution. People used it to enhance art experiences, facilitate philosophical conversations, or simply zone out under the stars while bass music rattled their rib cages. Each festival developed its own ketamine culture. At Coachella, it was glamorous, beautiful people doing bumps in VIP sections. At underground raves, it was gritty, crusty ravers passing around baggies in grimy bathrooms. At Burning Man, it was spiritual. People claiming ketamine helped them access higher consciousness or communicate with the desert itself. The drug adapted to its environment, reflecting the values and aesthetics of each scene. Artists began referencing ketamine in their work, electronic musicians titled Tracks K-Hole or Special K. Visual artists created installations inspired by dissociative states. Writers penned essays about ketamine experiences, trying to capture the ineffable weirdness of ego dissolution. The drug became a meme, a metaphor, a shorthand for a particular kind of consciousness exploration that was simultaneously profound and absurd. Internet culture amplified ketamine's mythology. Trip report forums like Arrowid and Blue Light hosted thousands of detailed accounts, the good, the bad, and the utterly bizarre. People described meeting entities, traveling through geometric dimensions, experiencing ego death, or just lying on a floor unable to move while their brain turned inside out. These reports served as both cautionary tales and inadvertent advertisements. They demystified ketamine while also building up its mystique. Reddit's drug communities became ketamine encyclopedias. Users shared dosage guides, harm reduction tips, and philosophical musings. They debated the nature of consciousness, the reality of K-hole entities, and whether ketamine was genuinely therapeutic or just a compelling illusion. The discussions ranged from deeply thoughtful to hilariously incoherent, often in the same thread. Ketamine had found its people, nerdy, exploratory, willing to take risks in pursuit of weird experiences. Ketamine humor emerged too. Memes about K-holes circulated on Twitter and Instagram. Jokes about becoming furniture, forgetting how to walk, or experiencing the heat death of the universe in a porta potty. The humor was self-deprecating, acknowledging ketamine's absurdity while celebrating it. It was the internet's way of domesticating a strange drug, making it less threatening through comedy. Celebrities occasionally mentioned ketamine, usually in interviews where they discussed their wild past. A few were more current, openly discussing ketamine therapy for depression or PTSD. Each disclosure sparked debates about drug policy, mental health, and whether celebrities were glamorizing substance use or courageously destigmatizing treatment. The answer, as always, was complicated. Documentaries and news features explored ketamine's cultural moment. Vice published articles with titles like Inside the K-Hole and Ketamine Cowboys of the Midwest. Netflix documentaries touched on ketamine as part of broader explorations of psychedelic culture. Each piece contributed to ketamine's mainstream visibility, transforming it from a niche party drug to a recognized cultural phenomenon. But with visibility came backlash. Parents' groups worried about ketamine's normalization. Treatment advocates worried that recreational use would undermine therapeutic applications. Law enforcement worried about rising overdose rates and drugging incidents. The cultural embrace of ketamine created conflicts between harm reduction and prohibition, between personal freedom and public safety, between medicine and recreation. By the late 2010s, ketamine occupied a weird cultural space. It was simultaneously a legitimate psychiatric medication, a party drug, a spiritual tool, a public health concern, a meme, a business opportunity, a research frontier, a cautionary tale. It meant different things to different people, and that multiplicity was part of its cultural power. Ketamine refused to be just one thing. It was protean, adaptable, endlessly recontextualized. From Ibiza beach clubs to Burning Man art cars to psychiatric clinics to Reddit forums, ketamine was everywhere, shape-shifting to fit each environment while remaining essentially, fundamentally itself, a molecule that dissolved boundaries, literally and metaphorically, and in a fragmented, complex world. Maybe that's exactly why it resonated so deeply. As ketamine therapy gained legitimacy, celebrities started opening up about their experiences. Some discussed using ketamine for depression or PTSD, framing it as medical treatment rather than recreational use. Others were more ambiguous, mentioning ketamine in ways that blurred the line between therapy and experimentation. Each confession generated headlines, public debates, and either stigma reduction or concern about glorification, depending on who you asked. Ketamine had achieved something rare. It was simultaneously medicine, party drug, and celebrity talking point. The celebrity confessions typically followed a pattern. Someone famous, an actor, musician, or entrepreneur would sit for an interview, usually promoting a project. The conversation would turn to mental health, a topic increasingly acceptable in public discourse. And then, actually, I tried ketamine therapy, and it really helped me. Cue the think pieces. Early celebrity discussions focused heavily on the medical framing. They'd talk about exhausting traditional treatments, feeling hopeless, then finding a psychiatrist who offered ketamine infusions. They'd describe the experience carefully, monitored, medical, prescribed, emphasizing that this wasn't recreational drug use. They were patients, not partygoers. The distinction mattered, both legally and reputationally. Some celebrities were more specific about their conditions. They discussed depression, complex PTSD, or addiction using ketamine as part of comprehensive treatment. They credited it with pulling them back from suicidal thoughts or helping them process trauma. These accounts were powerful testimonials, and they undoubtedly helped reduce stigma around both mental health treatment and ketamine specifically. Others were vaguer. They'd mention ketamine in passing, alongside meditation, therapy, and other wellness practices. They'd use language like transformative experience or expanded consciousness without specifying whether they meant clinical treatment or something less formal. This ambiguity made people uncomfortable. Was this medicine, or was it wealthy people getting legally high and calling it therapy? A few celebrities courted controversy deliberately. They'd discuss ketamine recreationally, framing it as part of their artistic process or personal exploration. They'd talk about K-holes at parties, weird insights gained while dissociated, or using ketamine to break through creative blocks. These confessions generated moral panic in tabloids and pearl clutching from parent groups, which of course only increased publicity. The impact on public perception was significant. When celebrities talked about ketamine positively, searches for ketamine therapy spiked. Clinics reported increased inquiries. Mainstream media ran explainers. Ketamine went from obscure to trendy, and trendiness had consequences. Some psychiatrists worried that celebrity endorsements created unrealistic expectations. Ketamine wasn't a miracle cure, and it didn't work for everyone. But desperate patients, inspired by celebrity testimonials, sometimes demanded it when other treatments might have been more appropriate. There was also a class dimension. Celebrity ketamine experiences often happened in luxury clinics with concierge psychiatrists, IV lounges that looked like spas, and price tags in the thousands. Meanwhile, uninsured patients struggled to access any ketamine treatment at all. The disparity was glaring. Celebrities could experiment with cutting-edge psychiatric treatments. Everyone else got whatever Medicaid covered, which usually wasn't ketamine. Social media amplified everything. When a celebrity mentioned ketamine, clips circulated on Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram. Fans discussed it, critics condemned it, and meme accounts made jokes. Ketamine became part of the cultural conversation in ways that most psychiatric medications never do. Nobody makes memes about Prozac or Lexapro, but ketamine was memorable discussable, fascinating. Some advocates celebrated celebrity confessions as destigmatization. Mental health treatment, especially experimental or alternative treatments, carried shame for many people. Seeing famous, successful individuals admit to trying ketamine normalized it, made it seem less taboo. If celebrities could be open about it, maybe regular people could too. Critics saw it differently. They worried about glamorization, making a dissociative drug seem cool, safe, or desirable when it carried real risks. They pointed out that celebrities had access to medical supervision, pure pharmaceutical-grade ketamine, and aftercare that most users didn't. Recreational use inspired by celebrity confessions could lead to harm, especially among young people who idolize these figures. The debate was never resolved because it reflected deeper tensions. Is psychiatric medication private or public? Should celebrities discuss their treatment? Does openness reduce stigma or create dangerous trends? Can we separate legitimate medical use from recreational misuse? These questions had no easy answers. What was clear, though, was that celebrity confessions changed ketamine's image. It became sophisticated, interesting, maybe even aspirational. Not just a horse tranquilizer, not just a rave drug, but something celebrities did. And in a celebrity-obsessed culture, that association carried weight. Ketamine had been rebranded again, this time not by pharmaceutical companies or researchers, but by famous people willing to say, "I tried it, and here's what happened." Whether that was progress or problem depended entirely on your perspective. But either way, ketamine was now mainstream, and there was no going back. So where does ketamine stand legally? In the United States, it's Schedule III, legal for medical use, illegal recreationally. Doctors can prescribe it off-label, which is how most ketamine therapy operates. Possession without a prescription is a crime, though enforcement varies wildly by jurisdiction. Internationally, the legal status is all over the map. Some countries classify it as a controlled substance. Others have minimal restrictions. The result is global legal limbo. Ketamine is simultaneously medicine, controlled substance, and gray market commodity, depending on where you are and how you're using it. In the United States, Schedule III status means ketamine is regulated, but accessible. Doctors and veterinarians can prescribe or dispense it with proper licensing and record keeping. Pharmacies stock it. Hospitals use it routinely. But if you're caught with it without a prescription, that's a federal crime, punishable by fines and imprisonment. The penalties vary by state. Some treat ketamine possession as seriously as cocaine. Others treat it more like prescription drug misuse. Enforcement is inconsistent. In practice, police focus on large-scale trafficking and obvious distribution. Personal possession often gets treated leniently, especially if it's a first offense. Prosecutors have limited resources and prioritize more serious crimes. So, while ketamine possession is technically illegal, consequences range from nothing to years in prison, depending on circumstances, location, and sometimes just bad luck. Off-label prescribing creates a legal gray zone. Technically, once a drug is FDA approved for any indication, doctors can prescribe it for anything they deem appropriate. This is how ketamine therapy for depression operates. It's legal, but it's not specifically approved for that use. This arrangement works until it doesn't. If a doctor prescribes recklessly, causes harm, or appears to be diverting drugs to recreational users, state medical boards can intervene, suspend licenses, or pursue criminal charges. The Spravato approval complicated things further. Now there's an FDA-approved ketamine product specifically for depression, but with significant restrictions. Does that make off-label use of generic ketamine more or less defensible? Should doctors prescribe Spravato instead? What about cost differences? Is it ethical to prescribe a vastly more expensive branded product when generic works fine? These questions create legal and ethical dilemmas for prescribers. Internationally, ketamine's legal status varies dramatically. China, despite being a manufacturing hub, classifies ketamine as a controlled psychotropic substance with harsh penalties. India allows it for medical and veterinary use with minimal restrictions. The UK recently upgraded ketamine to Class B, increasing penalties. Australia requires special permits. Some countries have no specific ketamine laws at all. This patchwork creates enforcement nightmares and opportunities for gray market operators. International drug treaties add another layer. Ketamine isn't specifically listed under UN drug control conventions, which means countries have flexibility in how they regulate it. Some advocates argue ketamine should remain unscheduled internationally to preserve medical access. Others argue it needs stricter global controls to prevent recreational use and trafficking. The debate continues in international forums with no resolution in sight. Online sales operate in the legal gray-est of gray zones. Websites sell research chemicals that are chemically identical to ketamine but labeled not for human consumption. Some ship from countries with lax regulations. Others operate openly, betting that authorities won't pursue small-scale buyers. Purchasing is risky. The product might be impure, the transaction might be monitored, and possession is still illegal. But thousands of people do it anyway, either for research, self-medication, or recreation. Ketamine therapy clinics operate legally but face regulatory scrutiny. State medical boards investigate clinics that seem exploitative or unsafe. The DEA monitors prescription patterns looking for diversion. But the regulatory framework was designed for traditional prescription drugs, not for novel therapeutic uses of old drugs. The rules don't quite fit, so everyone, regulators, clinicians, patients, is improvising. Drug policy reformers see ketamine as a test case. If a drug can be simultaneously dangerous and therapeutic, illegal and prescribed, how should law balance public safety with medical access? Some argue ketamine should be decriminalized for personal use, like Portugal's drug policy model. Others argue regulations should tighten to prevent abuse. The debate mirrors broader conversations about drug policy, harm reduction, and individual freedom. For now, ketamine exists in legal limbo. Not quite legal, not quite illegal, somewhere in between depending on context. You can get it prescribed for depression, but you can't buy it at a party. You can possess it with a prescription, but not without. You can research it scientifically, but marketing it for recreation is a crime. The boundaries are clear in theory, blurry in practice, and that ambiguity, that space between legal and illegal, medical and recreational, helpful and harmful, is where ketamine has always lived. It's a drug defined by in-betweenness, by existing in multiple states simultaneously, by refusing to fit neatly into any category. And maybe that's the most ketamine thing about it. If high doses put you in a K-hole and therapeutic doses require medical supervision, what about microdoses? Some people are experimenting with tiny regular amounts of ketamine, just enough to feel a subtle mood lift or cognitive shift without full dissociation. It's not FDA approved, not well studied, and definitely not recommended by doctors. But in the world of biohacking and self-optimization, microdosing ketamine is the latest frontier. Proponents claim it helps with anxiety, creativity, and mood stability. Critics warn it's a fast track to psychological dependence, disguised as self-improvement. The microdosing trend came straight from the psychedelic playbook. LSD and psilocybin microdosing gained popularity in Silicon Valley and creative communities, with people taking sub-perceptual doses for productivity and mood enhancement. When ketamine's antidepressant properties became widely known, the question arose, could the same approach work with ketamine? Could you get therapeutic benefits without the dissociation, the medical supervision, or the expensive clinic visits? Early experimenters started with tiny amounts, 10 to 20 milligrams, usually administered nasally or sublingually. At these doses, there's no K-hole, no obvious intoxication, just a subtle shift. Users report feeling lighter, more present, less burdened by anxious thoughts. Some describe enhanced creativity, increased emotional openness, or improved focus. The effects are gentle enough that they can microdose in the morning and go about their day normally, work meetings, social interactions, mundane tasks, without anyone noticing. The appeal is obvious. Therapeutic ketamine infusions cost hundreds of dollars per session and require clinic visits. Microdosing is cheap, convenient, and private. You control the dose, the timing, the context. No medical gatekeepers, no insurance hassles, no supervision. For people with treatment-resistant depression or anxiety who can't access or afford clinical ketamine, microdosing seems like a reasonable DIY alternative. For biohackers and self-optimizers, it's another tool for cognitive enhancement. But here's the problem. There's virtually no scientific research on ketamine microdosing. The therapeutic studies use much higher doses administered in controlled settings. Nobody knows if microdosing produces genuine antidepressant effects or just mild dissociative euphoria that people mistake for improvement. Nobody knows the long-term consequences of regular, repeated low-dose ketamine use. Nobody knows optimal dosing, frequency, or duration. It's a giant experiment with a sample size of 1, yourself. The risk of psychological dependence is significant. Even small doses can be mood-altering, and when something reliably makes you feel better, it's easy to develop a reliance on it. People start microdosing once a week, then twice, then daily. They tell themselves it's medicine, but the pattern looks like addiction. The dose creeps up. 10 milligrams stops working, so they try 20, then 30. Before long, they're not microdosing anymore. They're just using ketamine regularly and calling it therapy. There's also the purity problem. Pharmaceutical-grade ketamine is expensive and hard to obtain legally without a prescription. Most people microdosing use ketamine from gray market or black market sources, which means uncertain purity and potential contaminants. They might be microdosing actual ketamine, or they might be microdosing ketamine mixed with who knows what. Without lab testing, there's no way to know. The cognitive effects of chronic low-dose ketamine are unknown. High-dose chronic use causes measurable cognitive impairment and brain changes. Does microdosing avoid these effects, or just delay them? Does taking small amounts frequently cause different problems than taking large amounts occasionally? The absence of research means everyone's guessing, and the stakes are your brain. Online communities have formed around ketamine microdosing, sharing protocols, experiences, and rationalizations. Reddit forums and Discord servers host detailed discussions of dosing schedules, sourcing strategies, and subjective effects. Some users are thoughtful and cautious, tracking their use carefully and watching for warning signs. Others are reckless, treating ketamine like a supplement and dismissing risks. The communities provide support, but also enable problematic use. When everyone's microdosing, it stops seeming like a risk and starts seeming normal. A few therapists quietly support patients who microdose, offering harm reduction guidance without officially endorsing the practice. They can't prescribe ketamine for microdosing. It's not approved, and the liability would be enormous. But if a patient's going to do it anyway, better to have medical oversight than none at all. And these arrangements exist in ethical gray zones, balancing professional responsibility with pragmatic care. The microdosing trend reflects broader tensions in modern medicine. When legitimate treatments are inaccessible due to cost or regulation, people self-medicate. When research moves slowly, patients experiment on themselves. When pharmaceutical companies control access to potentially helpful drugs, gray markets emerge. Ketamine microdosing is a symptom of a broken system. People so desperate for relief that they're willing to take risks that no doctor would recommend. Is microdosing ketamine the future of psychiatric self-care or a dangerous fad? Nobody knows yet. It's too new, too understudied, too variable. Some people probably benefit. Some probably harm themselves. Most probably exist in a middle zone, getting some relief, taking some risks, and hoping it works out. But one thing's certain. As long as mental health treatment remains expensive, inaccessible, and inadequate for many people, they'll keep experimenting with whatever tools they can find. And ketamine, with its unique properties and complex history, will keep attracting people looking for answers outside the medical mainstream. Whether that's innovation or tragedy depends on who you ask. Ketamine research is exploding. Hundreds of studies are investigating its potential for treating not just depression, but PTSD, chronic pain, alcoholism, and even suicidal ideation. Universities are launching ketamine research centers. The National Institutes of Health is funding large-scale trials. Private companies are developing ketamine analogs, modified molecules that might preserve the benefits while reducing the side effects or abuse potential. It's a genuine research renaissance, driven by decades of overlooked potential, finally getting the attention it deserves. The transformation happened remarkably fast. In the early 2000s, ketamine was a psychiatric curiosity, interesting, but too weird and controversial for mainstream research. By the 2010s, it was one of the hottest topics in neuroscience. What changed? Results. Study after study confirmed that ketamine worked for treatment-resistant depression, and it worked fast. That kind of consistent evidence is impossible to ignore. Major research institutions established dedicated ketamine programs. Yale, Mount Sinai, the National Institute of Mental Health, all launched studies exploring ketamine's mechanisms, optimal dosing, and potential applications. Researchers who'd spent careers studying serotonin-based antidepressants suddenly pivoted to glutamate. Grant applications that mentioned ketamine, once viewed skeptically, started getting funded. The drug had credibility now. PTSD emerged as a particularly promising application. Trauma disorders involve stuck, hyperactive fear memories that won't extinguish normally. Ketamine's ability to promote neuroplasticity suggested it might help patients reprocess traumatic memories and form new, less distressing associations. Early trials showed encouraging results. Veterans and assault survivors reported significant symptom reduction after ketamine-assisted therapy. The research is still preliminary, but the potential is enormous. Chronic pain research took a different angle. Ketamine had long been used as an analgesic in emergency medicine, but researchers started exploring its potential for chronic conditions like complex regional pain syndrome and neuropathic pain. The theory was that chronic pain involved maladaptive neural patterns, similar to depression. Ketamine's ability to disrupt and reset those patterns might provide lasting relief. Some patients experienced dramatic improvements, others didn't respond. Scientists are trying to figure out why. Addiction research presented fascinating ironies. Could a drug with addiction potential treat other addictions? Studies suggested yes. Ketamine-assisted therapy for alcoholism showed promise. The combination of ketamine's neuroplasticity effects and intensive therapy helped some people break destructive drinking patterns. Similar research explored cocaine and opioid dependence. The idea was that ketamine could create a window of mental flexibility where behavioral change became possible. The suicidal ideation research was perhaps most urgent. Suicide is a psychiatric emergency, and traditional antidepressants take weeks to work, weeks during which patients remain at extreme risk. Ketamine's rapid effects offered a potential lifeline. Studies showed that a single ketamine infusion could reduce suicidal thoughts within hours, buying time for longer-term interventions. For emergency psychiatrists, this was revolutionary. But not all research was positive. Scientists also documented ketamine's downsides: bladder toxicity, cognitive effects, abuse potential, and the challenge of maintaining benefits after treatment ends. Long-term safety studies revealed concerning patterns in chronic users. These findings tempered enthusiasm and reminded everyone that ketamine wasn't a miracle. It was a powerful drug with serious trade-offs. Mechanism research dove deeper into the neuroscience. How exactly does blocking NMDA receptors lead to antidepressant effects? Researchers identified specific molecular pathways, particular brain regions, and timing factors. They discovered that ketamine's effects involved not just glutamate and BDNF, but also mTOR signaling, synaptic protein synthesis, and inflammatory modulation. The picture grew more complex and more interesting. Analog development became a major focus. Could chemists create ketamine-like molecules with better properties? Companies pursued drugs that preserved antidepressant effects while eliminating dissociation, reducing abuse potential, or improving safety profiles. Some analogs showed promise in animal studies. Human trials were underway. The goal was ketamine without the weird parts, though some researchers worried that the weird parts might be essential to the therapeutic effects. Personalized medicine research asked, who benefits from ketamine? Not everyone responds, and predicting responders would be incredibly valuable. Scientists looked for biomarkers, genetic variants, brain imaging patterns, blood markers that might identify ideal candidates. Early results were mixed, but the field was moving toward precision psychiatry, where treatments could be matched to individual biology. The research renaissance also brought renewed ethical scrutiny. With so much excitement and so much money involved, were researchers overselling ketamine's potential? Were pharmaceutical companies exaggerating benefits and downplaying risks? Were vulnerable patients being enrolled in studies that might not help them? These concerns led to stricter oversight, more rigorous trial designs, and ongoing debates about research ethics. Despite challenges, the research momentum continued building. By the early 2020s, ketamine wasn't just a research topic, it was a research ecosystem. Journals dedicated special issues to it. Conferences held entire symposia. Young scientists built careers studying it. And the discoveries kept coming. New applications, new mechanisms, new questions. Ketamine, after 60 years of existence, was finally getting the scientific attention it deserved. And the more scientists looked, the more they found. The drug that started as an anesthetic became a party drug, and then a psychiatric medication was revealing itself to be something even stranger, a molecule that challenged fundamental assumptions about how brains work, how consciousness operates, and how mental illness might be treated. The research renaissance wasn't just about ketamine, it was about rethinking psychiatry itself. Ketamine often gets lumped in with psychedelics like LSD, psilocybin, and MDMA, but they're actually quite different. Psychedelics work primarily through serotonin receptors, producing colorful visuals, emotional amplification, and increased connectivity between brain regions. Ketamine works through glutamate, producing dissociation, reduced connectivity, and a sense of detachment from reality. Psychedelics tend to intensify emotions. Ketamine tends to flatten them. Psychedelics create complex visual hallucinations. Ketamine creates abstract geometries and voids. They're different tools for different jobs, and confusing them can lead to unexpected and unpleasant experiences. Let's start with mechanisms. Classic psychedelics, LSD, psilocybin, mescaline, DMT, are serotonergic. They bind primarily to 5-HT2A serotonin receptors, causing widespread changes in brain activity. These changes increase connectivity between normally separate brain regions, leading to synesthesia, enhanced pattern recognition, and the sensation of profound meaning in ordinary objects. Your brain on psychedelics is hyper-connected, with different regions talking to each other in unusual ways. Ketamine, by contrast, is glutamatergic. It blocks NMDA receptors, disrupting normal glutamate signaling and causing decreased connectivity between brain regions. Your brain on ketamine is fragmented, with different regions operating independently rather than in coordination. And this explains the dissociation. Your sense of self comes from integrated brain activity. So when that integration breaks down, you start to feel like a collection of separate pieces rather than a unified whole. The subjective experiences differ dramatically. Psychedelics typically amplify emotions. If you're happy, you become euphoric. If you're anxious, you might become terrified. Emotions are vivid, intense, sometimes overwhelming. Ketamine, by contrast, creates emotional detachment. You might think about sad things without feeling sad, remember trauma without emotional reactivity. This difference makes them useful for different therapeutic applications. Psychedelics for emotional processing and insight, ketamine for disrupting negative thought patterns and reducing emotional reactivity. Visual effects also differ. Psychedelic visuals are often beautiful, intricate, colorful, breathing walls, geometric patterns overlaid on reality, enhanced colors, morphing objects. You're still clearly in the world, just seeing it differently. Ketamine visuals are stranger, abstract voids, tunnels of darkness, geometry that doesn't resemble anything in normal reality, or sometimes just absence, a sense of existing in empty space. At high doses, ketamine can eliminate visual perception entirely. You're not seeing weird things, you're not seeing anything because the concept of seeing has temporarily ceased to exist. Duration matters too. Psychedelic trips last hours, 6 to 12 hours for LSD, 4 to 6 for psilocybin. You're committed for the duration, and there's no exit ramp. Ketamine trips are much shorter, 30 minutes to 2 hours, depending on dose and route of administration. This shorter duration makes ketamine more manageable therapeutically. If a patient has a difficult experience, it's over relatively quickly. With psychedelics, a difficult experience can last all day. The therapeutic applications reflect these differences. Psychedelic-assisted therapy typically involves high doses that produce intense, emotionally meaningful experiences. Patients work through trauma, gain insights, and often describe the session as one of the most significant experiences of their lives. Ketamine therapy can involve high doses, but it also works at lower, subdissociative doses that don't produce intense experiences at all. The therapeutic benefit might not come from the experience itself, but from the neural changes ketamine triggers. Set and setting, the user's mindset and environment, affect both psychedelics and ketamine, but differently. Psychedelics are highly sensitive to set and setting. The same dose can produce heaven or hell depending on mood, environment, and expectations. Ketamine is somewhat more predictable. While set and setting matter, the dissociative effects occur regardless. You might have a peaceful K-hole or a terrifying one, but you're having a K-hole either way. The risk profiles also differ. Psychedelics have minimal physical toxicity and no addiction potential. You can't overdose on LSD or psilocybin in any practical sense, and nobody becomes addicted to them. But psychological risks exist. Bad trips, exacerbation of mental illness, triggering latent psychosis in vulnerable individuals. Ketamine has different risks: bladder damage from chronic use, psychological dependence, cognitive impairment, and the dangers of being fully dissociated and unable to protect yourself. Culturally, psychedelics and ketamine occupy different spaces. Psychedelics have a long history of spiritual and shamanic use, associations with consciousness expansion and personal growth. Ketamine's associations are more clinical: anesthesia, medicine, parties, and less inherently spiritual. People don't traditionally think of ketamine as a path to enlightenment, though John Lilly and others certainly tried to change that perception. The research trajectories have been parallel but separate. Psychedelic research was shut down in the 70s after moral panic and regulatory crackdown. It only restarted in the 90s and 2000s, focusing on therapeutic applications. Ketamine research never stopped. It was always medically legitimate. But psychiatric applications weren't seriously explored until the 2000s. Now both are experiencing research renaissances, but in different therapeutic niches. Some people combine them, mixing ketamine with psychedelics to create unique experiences. These combinations are poorly studied and potentially dangerous. The drugs affect different neurotransmitter systems, and interactions are unpredictable. Some users report synergy. Others report overwhelming confusion. Harm reduction advocates strongly discourage combining dissociatives and psychedelics, especially at high doses. The bottom line: psychedelics and ketamine are both consciousness-altering, both being researched for psychiatric applications, and both controversial. But they're fundamentally different tools. Lumping them together as psychedelics is chemically inaccurate and practically misleading. They work differently, feel different, have different risks, and serve different purposes. Understanding these differences matters for researchers designing studies, therapists planning treatments, and users making decisions. The drugs don't care if you understand them, but your brain does. And giving your brain the wrong tool for the job rarely ends well. Let's be clear: the safest way to use ketamine is under medical supervision for legitimate medical purposes. But people are going to use it recreationally anyway, so let's talk harm reduction. First, test your substances. Fentanyl-laced ketamine kills people. Use reagent test kits to verify you actually have ketamine. Second, start with small doses and wait. Ketamine hits fast, but affects people differently. Third, never mix ketamine with alcohol or other depressants. The combination can suppress breathing. Fourth, never use alone. If you K-hole or have a bad reaction, you need someone sober to help. Fifth, watch for warning signs of bladder damage, painful urination, blood in urine, constant urgency. If these appear, stop immediately and see a doctor. Harm reduction isn't endorsement, it's pragmatism. Harm reduction acknowledges reality. Prohibition doesn't stop drug use, it just makes it more dangerous. People use ketamine despite risks, so the goal is minimizing harm when abstinence isn't realistic. This approach frustrates everyone. Prohibitionists see it as enabling, libertarians see it as unnecessary paternalism, but it saves lives. Testing substances is non-negotiable. The street drug market is contaminated with fentanyl, which is deadly in tiny amounts. Ketamine and fentanyl look similar, white crystalline powders, so visual inspection means nothing. Reagent test kits are cheap, legal, and reliable. A Mandolin or Morris test turns characteristic colors in the presence of ketamine. If the test doesn't match, don't use the substance. Yes, dealers might lie. Yes, batches vary. Test every time. Dose carefully. Ketamine's effects are highly dose-dependent. A small bump, 25 to 50 ml, produces mild euphoria and wonkiness. A moderate dose, 75 to 100 ml, produces significant dissociation. A large dose, 200 mg plus, produces K-holes and complete incapacitation. The difference between fun and terrifying can be 50 milligrams. New users should start low, wait at least 30 minutes, and only redose if confident they can handle more. Experienced users should remember that tolerance is real and dosing patterns escalate. Route of administration matters. Intramuscular injection hits hardest and fastest, used medically but rare recreationally. Intranasal, snorting, is most common recreationally, quick onset, moderate duration, hard on nasal passages. Oral is slower and less predictable, longer duration, more metabolites, higher bladder toxicity risk. Each route has different bioavailability, so dosing isn't equivalent across routes. Don't assume that if you snorted 100 mg safely, you can eat 100 mg safely. Never combine ketamine with CNS depressants. Ketamine plus alcohol, benzodiazepines, opioids, or GHB can cause dangerous respiratory depression. Ketamine alone doesn't suppress breathing much, but combinations can be fatal. This kills people, partygoers who mix substances recklessly, thinking I've done each separately, so combining is fine. It's not fine. CNS depression is synergistic, not additive. Combinations with stimulants, cocaine, amphetamines, are dangerous for different reasons. Ketamine can mask stimulant effects, leading to overdoses. The cardiac strain of mixing stimulants and dissociatives is poorly understood, but potentially severe. Calvin Klein, cocaine plus ketamine, is popular in some scenes, but it's cardiovascular Russian roulette. Set and setting remain important even for recreational use. Ketamine in a comfortable, safe environment with trusted friends is very different from ketamine in a crowded, chaotic club. If you're going to use, choose your environment deliberately. Have a plan for if things go wrong. Designate a sober person to monitor. Know where exits are. Have emergency contacts accessible. Frequency matters enormously. Occasional ketamine use, a few times a year, is unlikely to cause serious physical harm. Regular use, weekly or more, significantly increases risks of bladder damage, cognitive impairment, and psychological dependence. Daily use is almost guaranteed to cause problems. If you find yourself using more often, that's a warning sign. Addiction sneaks up slowly, justified by incrementalism. I used to do it monthly, now it's every other week. That's not so bad. Yes, it is. Monitor for bladder symptoms. Ketamine bladder is insidious. Early stages are subtle, but damage accumulates. Pay attention to urinary changes, frequency, urgency, pain, blood. These aren't normal and don't resolve on their own. If they appear, stop using ketamine immediately and see a urologist. Don't lie to the doctor. They need to know what's causing the problem to treat it effectively. Mental health monitoring is equally important. If you're using ketamine to self-medicate depression or anxiety, you need actual treatment. Ketamine might provide temporary relief, but underlying conditions remain. Self-medication usually escalates, and eventually you're stuck. Not better, just dependent on a drug to feel baseline normal. If you recognize this pattern, seek help. Harm reduction also means knowing when to call for help. If someone becomes unresponsive, stops breathing normally, vomits while unconscious, or shows signs of serious medical distress, call emergency services. Don't worry about legal consequences. Good Samaritan laws protect people who call for help in overdose situations in many jurisdictions. A drug charge is better than a death. Harm reduction resources exist. Organizations like DanceSafe offer testing kits, educational materials, and non-judgmental information. Online communities like Arrowid and Blue Light provide experience reports and safety discussions. These aren't endorsements of drug use. They're acknowledgments that people use drugs and deserve accurate information. The reality is complicated. Some people use ketamine recreationally for years without serious consequences. Others are harmed quickly. The difference often comes down to dose, frequency, circumstances, and individual vulnerability. Harm reduction can't eliminate risk, but it can reduce it significantly. And in a world where people will use drugs regardless of prohibition, reduction might be the best we can do. It's not perfect, it's not ideal, but it's pragmatic. And sometimes pragmatism saves lives when idealism doesn't. So where does ketamine go from here? It's impossible to say. The drug exists simultaneously in multiple worlds: legitimate medicine, recreational substance, research frontier, cultural symbol. Maybe ketamine clinics become standard psychiatric care, covered by insurance, integrated into mainstream treatment. Maybe recreational use continues in the shadows, unaffected by medical legitimization. Maybe research discovers ketamine analogs that separate therapeutic benefits from abuse potential, making the original molecule obsolete. Or maybe ketamine remains exactly what it's always been: a strange liminal substance that refuses to fit neatly into any category. Medicine, myth, or both? Probably both. Ketamine has always been both. The medical future looks promising, but uncertain. If research continues confirming ketamine's effectiveness for depression, PTSD, and other conditions, it could become a psychiatric staple. Insurance coverage would expand, access would improve, and millions of patients might benefit. Ketamine could do for depression what Prozac did in the 90s, not a miracle cure, but a game changer that gave hope to people who'd exhausted other options. But obstacles remain. The medical establishment is conservative, and ketamine's history as a party drug creates lingering stigma. Some psychiatrists resist prescribing it, uncomfortable with dissociative effects or worried about abuse. Training and infrastructure are lacking. Most psychiatrists haven't been taught how to use ketamine therapeutically. Building that expertise takes time, resources, and cultural change within medicine. The pharmaceutical industry will keep pursuing ketamine analogs. If they can develop drugs with ketamine's benefits, but fewer downsides, less dissociation, less abuse potential, longer-lasting effects, those drugs could replace ketamine entirely. Several candidates are in development. Whether they'll succeed is uncertain. Sometimes when you modify a molecule to remove undesirable effects, you also remove the therapeutic benefits. The dissociation might be essential, not incidental. Recreationally, ketamine isn't going anywhere. Despite decades of regulation, enforcement, and stigma, recreational use persists. As long as people seek altered consciousness, escape, or novel experiences, ketamine will remain attractive. Its effects are unique, and no other drug replicates them. The supply chain has proven resilient and adaptable. Underground chemists, international suppliers, and gray market operators ensure availability. Prohibition has never eliminated a drug for which demand exists. The cultural conversation will continue evolving. As ketamine therapy becomes normalized, the distinction between medical and recreational use will blur further. People will question why therapeutic ketamine is celebrated while recreational use is criminalized when they're chemically identical. These questions feed into broader drug policy debates about harm reduction, personal freedom, and the role of government in regulating consciousness. Research will uncover new mysteries. The more scientists study ketamine, the more they realize how little they understand. Why does it work for some people but not others? Why do effects vary so wildly? What are the long-term consequences of repeated use? How do genetic differences influence response? Each answer generates new questions. Ketamine research might continue for decades, constantly revealing new complexity. The legal landscape will probably remain messy. Schedule III status works for now, but might change if recreational use spikes or medical use expands. International regulation could tighten or loosen depending on national priorities and scientific evidence. Drug policy is driven by politics, moral panics, and economic interests as much as by science. Predicting legal changes is nearly impossible. Ketamine's greatest legacy might be conceptual. It forced psychiatry to look beyond serotonin, to consider glutamate and neuroplasticity, to accept that rapid antidepressant effects were possible. It demonstrated that drugs with abuse potential could also be therapeutic, nuance that medicine historically resists. It showed that anesthetics, psychedelics, and psychiatric medications aren't separate categories, but overlapping ones. Ketamine broke down boundaries, literally and metaphorically. There's also a philosophical dimension. Ketamine raises questions about consciousness, identity, and reality that science can't fully answer. What does it mean that a molecule can dissolve your sense of self? Are K-hole experiences genuine alternate realities or just neural noise? When ketamine relieves depression, is it fixing a chemical imbalance or providing a useful illusion? These questions matter less for treatment than for understanding what consciousness is. The personal stories will continue accumulating. People saved from suicide by ketamine infusions. People whose lives were destroyed by ketamine addiction. Ravers who K-holed at festivals and swear it was transcendent. Chronic users with destroyed bladders and ruined lives. Researchers who dedicated careers to studying it. Doctors who risked reputations prescribing it. Each story adds to ketamine's mythology, layer upon layer of meaning and experience. 50 years from now, what will ketamine be? Maybe a standard psychiatric medication, as common as SSRIs. Maybe a footnote in medical history, replaced by better drugs. Maybe still exactly what it is today, controversial, useful, dangerous, fascinating, existing in the spaces between categories. If ketamine has taught us anything, it's that molecules don't care about our categories. They just do what they do chemically. We're the ones who assign meanings. Medicine, drug, tool, problem, miracle, disaster. Ketamine is all of these. It always has been. From that lab in 1962 to hospital operating rooms to jungle battlefields to warehouse raves to psychiatric clinics to research laboratories, ketamine has been many things to many people. And it will keep being many things because that's what ketamine does. It refuses singular definition. It exists in multiplicity. And maybe that's the most important lesson. Sometimes the most interesting things in life, molecules, experiences, truths, can't be reduced to single categories. They're both and, not either or. Medicine and myth, poison and cure, consciousness and oblivion. Ketamine contains multitudes, and its future, like its past, will probably contain contradictions we can't yet imagine. But we'll be here to witness them, one strange trip at a time. Here's something that doesn't get talked about enough: ketamine's role in the opioid overdose crisis. Emergency responders started carrying ketamine for a surprising reason. It's incredibly useful for agitated or combative patients experiencing overdoses or drug-induced psychosis. Someone high on methamphetamine or synthetic cannabinoids, thrashing violently and dangerous to themselves and others, can be safely sedated with ketamine without suppressing their breathing. It's also being explored as a tool for managing acute opioid withdrawal. But there's a darker side. As fentanyl contamination spreads through the drug supply, ketamine itself has become a vector. People think they're buying ketamine and end up with fentanyl-laced powder. The intersection of ketamine and the overdose crisis reveals how interconnected and dangerous the modern drug landscape has become. The emergency medical use makes perfect sense when you understand the problems responders face. Someone overdosing on opioids is unconscious and unresponsive. That's manageable with naloxone and supportive care. But someone high on stimulants or having a violent psychotic episode, that's dangerous for everyone involved. Traditional sedatives like benzodiazepines work slowly and can worsen respiratory problems. Physical restraints can cause injury or death through positional asphyxiation or excited delirium. Ketamine offers a better option. Intramuscular injection works within minutes, doesn't require patient cooperation, and sedates reliably without killing respiratory drive. Paramedics and police started using it for chemical restraint in psychiatric emergencies and violent overdose situations. It became standard protocol in many jurisdictions. If someone's a danger to themselves or others and physical restraint isn't working, ketamine brings them down safely. But this use sparked controversy. Civil liberties groups documented cases where ketamine was used inappropriately on people who weren't actually violent or in doses too high for the person's body weight or without proper medical justification. Several deaths were linked to ketamine administration by paramedics, usually involving excessive doses or underlying medical conditions. The line between life-saving intervention and chemical compliance became uncomfortably blurry. The fentanyl contamination problem is even more disturbing. As fentanyl flooded the illicit drug market, it didn't just contaminate heroin and fake prescription pills. It contaminated everything: cocaine, methamphetamine, MDMA, and yes, ketamine. Dealers cutting products with fentanyl, either deliberately to increase potency and addictiveness, or accidentally through cross-contamination in processing facilities. The result: people buying what they believe is ketamine, testing positive for ketamine on reagent tests, but actually receiving ketamine mixed with enough fentanyl to kill them. This created a public health nightmare. Ketamine users, unlike opioid users, don't have tolerance to fentanyl. They're not carrying naloxone. They're not expecting respiratory depression. They take what they think is a normal ketamine dose, and minutes later, they're unconscious and dying. Friends don't recognize it as an overdose because it doesn't look like a K-hole. It looks like someone who stopped breathing. Harm reduction organizations responded by emphasizing fentanyl test strips, small, cheap strips that detect fentanyl in drug samples. The strips aren't perfect, but they catch many contaminated batches. The problem is awareness. Many ketamine users don't realize their drug of choice is at risk. They associate fentanyl with opioids and don't think to test. There's also the issue of polydrug use. Many people in overdose situations have used multiple substances, opioids and ketamine together, or ketamine and alcohol, or complex combinations. Ketamine complicates overdose response because it masks symptoms. Someone who's taken both heroin and ketamine might be in respiratory distress from the heroin, but the ketamine's dissociative effects make them appear conscious and responsive when they are actually dangerously hypoxic. Research into ketamine for opioid withdrawal is more optimistic. Early studies suggest ketamine might ease the acute withdrawal symptoms that make quitting opioids so difficult. The theory is that ketamine's effects on pain perception and neural plasticity could help patients through the worst days of withdrawal, while also addressing underlying depression that often accompanies addiction. It's preliminary, and using one potentially addictive drug to treat addiction to another raises obvious concerns, but the desperation of the opioid crisis makes researchers willing to explore unconventional options. The intersection reveals an uncomfortable truth. No drug exists in isolation. Ketamine's medical utility in overdose response saves lives. Its presence in a contaminated drug supply takes lives. Its potential as an addiction treatment offers hope. Its own addiction potential creates harm. These contradictions aren't resolvable. They're just reality. Ketamine sits at the crossroads of multiple crises: mental health, addiction, drug policy, harm reduction. And at crossroads, things get complicated fast. Emergency responders, harm reduction workers, researchers, and users all navigate this complexity daily, making impossible calculations about risk and benefit. There are no clean answers, just people trying to survive and help others survive in a landscape where every drug is potentially fatal and every intervention carries trade-offs. Ketamine didn't create this crisis, but it's become part of it, sometimes solution, sometimes problem, often both simultaneously. And as the overdose crisis evolves, ketamine's role will keep shifting, reflecting the strange, tragic, complicated relationship between humans and the molecules we use to alter consciousness, ease pain, and occasionally, accidentally, kill ourselves. And that, friends, is the wild, winding journey of ketamine, from a 1960s lab experiment to horse tranquilizer to battlefield lifesaver to rave staple to psychiatric breakthrough. It's a story that refuses to follow a straight line, much like the drug itself. So, as you drift off tonight, maybe take a moment to appreciate the strangeness of it all. We live in a world where the same molecule can sedate an elephant, launch someone into an alternate dimension at a music festival, and pull a suicidal person back from the edge within hours. The same substance that veterinarians keep in locked cabinets is also sitting in psychiatric clinics, helping people who'd exhausted every other option. That's not just medical history. That's a reminder of how beautifully, terrifyingly complicated science and human experience can be. Thank goodness we're not living through ketamine's early days, testing mystery molecules on prisoners, performing battlefield surgery in Vietnam jungles, or being the first person to accidentally discover the K-hole. We get to learn from all that chaos, all those experiments, All those mistakes and breakthroughs, from the comfort of our beds with our fans humming and our pillows perfectly arranged. Modern medicine, for all its flaws, means you don't have to synthesize your own antidepressants or steal tranquilizers from veterinary clinics. We have research, regulations, and at least some idea of what we're doing. Not perfect, but better than the alternative. So, rest easy knowing that whether ketamine ends up being the future of psychiatry or just a fascinating footnote in medical history, its story is a testament to human curiosity, resilience, and our endless ability to find both healing and trouble in the same small molecule. Thanks for listening, everyone. If you enjoyed this journey through ketamine's strange history, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment about what historical topic you'd like to explore. Next, sweet dreams, and I'll see you in the next one.